I always consider them like we fly helicopters, and relatively speaking, well, this is pretty easy because I know how much it sucks on the ground. Of course, you always have to ask me. When I was in SEAL teams, I'm not sure I'd have had the metal to do what these guys are doing, and so I was always absolutely in awe. Which sounds funny. I was in awe of the customers, even though I was one at one time, because what I would see them do every single night, the American public has absolutely no idea what they endured over a 6 hour period just to get to a target, only to be dealt with, no kidding, overwhelming fire, guys getting shot left and right. They were exfils where we had to bring these guys out, whether that's under fire or whatever. But some of the most gut wrenching, difficult things we had to do is flying helicopters with guys dying on the back.
Welcome to Combat Story. I'm Ryan Fugit, and I served Warzone tours as an Army attack helicopter pilot and CIA officer over a 15-year career. I'm fascinated by the experiences of the elite in combat. On this show, I interview some of the best to understand what combat felt like on their front lines. This is Combat Story. Today, we hear the combat story of Mike Rutledge, a Navy SEAL turned 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, or Soar Aviator, who completed 17 combat deployments over a 30-year career. This is a special episode for me personally because I went to flight school with Mike, as we discussed in this episode, and I still remember being in awe when I saw this other flight school candidate wearing a trident on his uniform. Mike had a very unconventional route to becoming a special operator in two branches, and flew along some of the greatest pilots of our time, including Mack, who you'll recall from a previous episode on Combat Story. Among the multitude of missions during his 17 deployments, Mike found himself one night on a mission in 2007 when he thought we were going to capture bin Laden. This was, of course, a dry hole, but generated lessons learned that were used in 2011 in the final raid. I hope you enjoy this wide-ranging and humble perspective into the world of someone who went from being a SEAL to a 160th Aviator as much as I did. Mike, thanks so much for taking the time to share your story with us today.
Thanks, Ryan. I'm happy to be here and excited you invited me.
So just before we jump into some of the questions here, I have to ask about this this item behind your shoulder with the trident on it. It looks like some type of alien. And for those who can't see it, if you could explain to people who are just listening and not watching this video, could you share what that is?
So that is actually a new addition to my office, and it's actually a Freddy the Frog, which on at the Basic Underwater Demolition Compound in Coronado, they've got a full size. Think of this. This is just the head or the bust of a full size, but it's about 6 feet tall, and it stands in the PT compound at Bud's. And he's got a sign around his neck actually that says, "So you want to be a frogman?" And that's the first thing you see when you come through the grinder at Bud's on your day you check in. And it's actually originally from a 1950s movie called Creature from the Black Lagoon. And where it's this creature from the Black Lagoon looks like this, and he just sloths around swamps and makes people disappear. So it's kind of appropriate. This actual bust was made by a fellow Bud's classmate, a guy named Stephen Mueller, who oddly also transferred over to the Army at the same time I went to Army flight school. He went to Army OCS, ended up going to Ranger Regiment and Ranger Recon Detachment, and then on to Special Forces Group and so on. He's now retired as well. But anyway, he was always a phenomenal artist, and he was always making drawings of this creature from the Black Lagoon. So that's his retirement gig now. Now he makes Freddy the Frog busts for frogmen and sells them for a nominal amount. But anyway, he makes like 50 of them a month. That's what he does in his retirement. So most of the guys from the Buds class got one in their office now.
That is really cool looking. And is it a regulator that's kind of around the base?
Yeah, he's got a Mark V. I don't know what they use now, but it's got a Draeger Mark V regulator and a Mark Navy dive knife in his mouth. And usually we've got my Buds class helmet on his head, but we don't have it on today.
That's really cool. Okay. So obviously, you mentioned Buds, the SEAL background that you have, and we'll touch on that. And then the aviation side in the Army. And one of the things as we were prepping, I just wanted to say, I remember distinctly meeting you the first time in flight school. So I was on the commission side in the Army, and we go into this room. We're all wearing our red hats because that's what class we're in. and it's officers and warrant officers for the first time in a classroom. And I remember seeing the trident on your uniform and thinking, Jesus Christ, where did this guy come from? And I just remember thinking that is one of the coolest things. We got a SEAL here, and it's post 9/11, so I could only imagine what it was like for you having left the teams at that time. It was 2002, late 2002, I
2002,
think.
yeah.
So I definitely want to hear more about it, but I just really remember that moment. And you said a lot of people do remember you. It's got to be memorable seeing the trident on an Army uniform.
Well, I feel bad, and I'll pretty much go wherever you want to take me. But now that I'm older and a dad and my kids are out of the house and stuff, and it's always like 50-50 of holy cow, that's the coolest thing I've ever seen, or holy cow, were you a jackass? So I guess it depends on what kind of a person you were, which version of me you got. But yeah, I mean, I would say I was pretty hopped up, just leaving the SEAL teams and coming straight over to the Army. One day I'm an E7 and then chief in the SEAL teams, and the next day I'm a E7 in the Army.
Jeez.
So it was quite I won't say I was actually cocky. I was just very, very excited to be there and coming down off of a huge high, that initial deployment and stuff after 9/11. So anyway, yeah, it
Oh
was pretty
man.
cool. And everybody kind of looked down at Fort Rucker with doom and gloom, like, oh, this is going to suck. And I actually remember that as being one of the most carefree, enjoyable periods of my 30 years, because I'm not in charge of anybody. There's no stress. I get to fly for free every day. I was home all the time, wasn't going anywhere. So yeah, where everybody else was kind of sad faced and wondering what was going to happen next, I was excited to be at Fort Rucker.
I was actually wondering how painful walk school must have been for you, having already gone through buds and being an E7 coming over and starting. And for people who don't know walk school, and just Mike, just correct me if I get this wrong, but that's effectively bringing people into the warrant officer cadre. And it's, I think to some degree, a lot of busy work and probably frustrating to somebody who's been in for quite some time.
Well, it was. I mean, it was meaningless. It wasn't hard, but then again, nothing was really required of me. And like everything else, the fat kid in me just made a humorous joke out of absolutely everything, which absolutely drove the cadre insane. I mean, because the only thing I had going for me, I didn't know anything about the Army. So, and to that point, my previous 12 years of enlisted time, the SEAL teams, all we did was make fun of the Army, which I find ironic, because I had already gone through airborne school. I was the only SEAL to ever go through Pathfinder school. The only one. They tested it and said, no, this is done. We're not sending anybody else. But I was the only one that went through that. I went through, just a whole bunch of Army schools and just mocking the Army every time I went through there because it wasn't my home. And then the Army's my home. So it was a bit of an adjustment. But, the only thing I had in walk school was, I was just in great shape. And so, if they said do 10 push-ups, I did 100 or kept doing push-ups until they yelled at me to stop, or, just anything I could do to annoy them, but not so much that I could get in trouble for it.
Yeah.
And that was before wokeness was really part of the Army, and there was females in the class, and I'd never ever been stationed with females before, ever in my whole career. So, I made fun of them at every turn and just mock, and it was probably, it was acceptable from where I came from. Obviously not acceptable um, in the Army, but
Much longer. Yeah.
it was a lot of fun. Yeah, it was enjoyable.
And actually, there are a couple of people we've had on the show who know you as well. Obviously, Al Mack. I think Tom Shea as well brought you up in the past. And it's so fun. And probably 4 people I've interviewed over the 100 people I've interviewed, and they'll say something like, "Yeah, there's this guy. He was in 160th. He was a SEAL." And every time I'm like, "Mike Rutledge." They're like, "How did you know him?" And I got to imagine there aren't many. How many SEALs did you run into in 160th? Are there a handful, or were you the only one?
There was maybe 3 or 4 total, and I can name them, but maybe they didn't do an entire career in the regiment, or I won't say it wasn't noteworthy because they were all noteworthy, but I guess maybe they weren't as big a personality as I would guess, So for better or worse, but yeah, guys like Tom Shea, that completely came. Our paths collided again 20 something years later with, no warning whatsoever. I think we'll get into it, but he probably told you that when I was commanding at West Point, his daughter came through and
That's right.
we ended up snagging her and sponsoring her for 4 years and kind of
That's
mentoring
awesome.
her. So yeah, anyway, pretty interesting how things pop up like that. So
Yeah.
every time I think that phase of life is over, there's somebody pops up, I'm like, holy cow, I haven't talked to you in 25 years. But yeah, it happens all the time. And I feel bad when I don't remember, all the faces, names, because there's a lot. You're not the only one,
Yeah.
right? There's a lot like,
Yeah.
I remember you doing this and that. And like I said, some are great and some are like, man, you were really mean. I'm like, was I mean to you? No, but you were mean. I'm like, well, then whoever I was being mean to probably deserved it. But
Yeah.
anyway,
No.
my only regret is that I don't remember all the faces and names along the way.
No, I remember it on very good terms, so no issue there. And you mentioned the jokes with the Army. I've been re-interviewing some guests who I've had on the show, and at the end, I've been asking them, "Hey, let's say you're sitting around a bar with people from other branches. What are some of the jabs that you would remember saying for people? Somebody who's in the Air Force or the Navy or the Marines or the Army. What are some of the jabs you used to throw at Army guys?"
I used to think they were just, so stiff and they've got rules for everything. And, I'm like, every place that you have an Army base sucks. It's the cheapest real estate in the country. I mean, there's just any number of knuckle dragging, mouth breathing, you're not smart enough to get into any of their service. And of course, then when I'm a W-4 in the Army, completely
Yeah.
changes my tune. But, what's funny is every single person I come across that's always curious, they're always like, well, who do you root for in Army Navy? And I always tell them, like, well, whoever's paying the bills, I'm like, I'm pretty loyal. Whoever's writing the checks at that time, that is who I'm at. I'm loyal. I ride for the brand. So,
Oh
um,
man.
and there's when I tell guys like, how do you compare the Army and Navy? Well, there's two different things. I was in the SEAL teams in the Navy, which your locations are always primo. You're always you're either on the beach in Coronado or on the beach in Hawaii or on the beach in Virginia Beach, and you always have the best of everything, and aside from combat deployments and such like that, I mean, you can't ask for a better quality of life other than the occupation itself. Um, I'm like, but outside of that, when I'm talking to young people who are considering careers in the Navy, and I'll tell them pretty frequently, I'm like, but don't get me wrong, there's 96% of the Navy that sucks so bad you don't even want to know about it, you just see my
It's good
career and
incentive though to
that's
get through
yeah.
buds, huh?
I'm like, that's not reality, and I mean, I used to in buds, I'd look across the bay every day and see all the green or the gray ships at 32nd Street, and that's pretty good motivator. So if I screw this up, I'm headed straight across the bay on one of those ships. And I just remember Bud's instructor. There was one Bud's instructor, I don't recall his name, but he's always like, you screw this up, boys, you'll be on a ship so far down, your feet will be in a V. And I always remember that. I'm like, he's like, there's places on the ship you won't even see daylight for weeks. And so, you know, half of that's rooted in reality. So
Yeah.
there's a lot of bad places you can go in the Army too, but sort of depends on either service. Just sort of depends on your level of motivation and what you aspire to.
Fair.
So they can both be awesome experiences, and they can both really suck depending on your level of motivation.
So one of the things that you mentioned earlier that really struck me, especially because the only way I know of you is from when you were a SEAL at flight school, that where you said the fat kid in me. And I can't imagine that being you at all. And doing the prep work for this, hearing how you grew up, I wanted to start there because I don't think anybody who knows you now who didn't know you as a kid would have said that you had that type of upbringing. So could you share just a little bit of the challenges that you grew up with?
Well, I mean, I never thought until I got older, I never thought I kind of had like a rough childhood, because I thought it was pretty normal. But
That's all
turns
you
out,
know.
not everybody goes through 3 or 4 stepdads, or has a suicide in the family, or is dirt poor. Their you know, mom's like basically terminally ill from the time they're 13 on. Um, but we all got through it, and so I never thought much about it until you get older and start having kids of your own. I mean, I was from at that time, a fairly small farm town in the middle of Illinois, Galesburg, Illinois. Um, and it kind of started fairly normal from what I remember, around 4 or 5 years old, something like that. But my mom was a great woman, but absolutely no education. Was really adept at scraping by and doing whatever she needed to do to survive and make sure her kids survived. But whatever shady stuff she was doing on the side, we never knew about because that's just what she did. She did what she had to do to provide for the kids and all that. And you don't realize that until you're older. And as a parent, my sister and I talk about it fairly frequently now. But so she made sure that as much as she could, we had a fairly balanced upbringing. She had a problem with men. She sort of went through them like every year. So to the extent that she was able to take care of us, that was always a variable. On which given year the stepdad was going to be a good one or a bad one or an abusive one or
Jeez.
whatever. Up until age 12, the stepdad of the year, who wasn't a super one, but he committed suicide in our basement when I was 12. Oddly, July 4th of 1983,
Wow.
and I kind of remember that obviously pretty specifically because our neighbors took us out to the drive-in movie. I guess we'd been out of the house when he actually did it, and our neighbors took my sister and I out to the drive-in movie because that was the only thing going on in Galesburg. And the drive-in movie of all things was Blue Thunder, which was like actually a pretty cool helicopter movie at the time. But anyway, they took us out to the movie, so obviously all those things that go along, the police investigation, all this stuff was at the house. So we didn't come to the house and
Wow.
you know have all that stuff going on. But anyway, so he was not a super guy. So oddly enough, when he passed, our life actually got immeasurably better. Um, so then my mom kind of started job hopping around. So then we ended up moving from Galesburg to Chicago or Chicago suburb. And then, so I spent my teen years in a Chicago suburb, which is fairly normal. But again, no male influences or anything. So I was kind of, except for sports and band, I was kind of rudderless. I would say
Yeah.
pretty much. I mean, I had lots of aspirations, but you know, no no reinforcement or home or no way to actually reach them. I just hung airplane pictures on my wall and hoped and dreamed and wished and never really did anything to get there. So
So my old man flew Hueys in Vietnam, but he never knew his father. And that was one of the things that struck me preparing for this. Could you just share a little bit about your experience with your dad, or
well,
or
I
what you might
never,
call the experience, lack
yeah,
of?
well, and I only mention that because now I find it ironic as an adult. Um, my like I said, my mom she was busy, in her 20s and 30s, and so I never met my dad, and I never knew it until 15 or 14 or something like that, when like one of the stepdads who I thought was, I called everybody dad, how impressionable kids are when they're young. Anyway, so he's like, "Well, I'm not really your dad," which I guess the pact she always made with these guys when she got married was, "Hey, you can't ever tell him, you know, that you're not his dad." So anyway, so she finally said, "Hey," which I find so odd, but she said, she was like, "Hey, your dad." She sent me down. I think it was 15 or 16, something around there, and she's like, "Hey, this is who your dad is." I met him whenever. I was working as a waitress, like one of those things out of a movie, and he had a family, so I just took you
Yeah.
and disappeared, and with this other guy who, some other stepdad, and anyway, so for whatever reason, she thought it was a good idea to track him down and introduce him to me when I was 16. Like I can't remember, I said my 16th birthday, but it was like a day or before or after my 16th birthday, something like that. And we're sitting in the house and she like walked him in and said, "Michael, I want to introduce you to Rick Orr, who's your dad." And he's since passed a long time, so there's no risk in upsetting anybody. But anyway, and I kind of looked at him and she's like, "And this is your dad." And so the guy was actually he was tall and, very fit for whatever it was, 50s or 60s at the time or something like that, and probably 50s. And, it turned out he knew I liked military stuff, even at that age. Anyway, he'd been a Marine and he'd been an infantry Marine in Korea,
Wow.
and gone on, so we immediately had things to talk about. And I got really, really attached, in that 30 minutes. And then in 30 minutes, he shook my hand and walked out and I never saw him again.
Get
So I'm not,
out, man.
yeah. So I never ever, and even after I'd had my own, after we'd had our first son and we're a little accomplished and stuff, and I tried to track him down and say, "Hey, don't want anything from you. I just wanted to explain, just wanted to show you, what I became. If you're curious," which I'm sure every adopted kid and all that kind of stuff, probably longs to do. Anyway, long story short, never found him, but that's it. Like I met the guy for 30 minutes, but it was pretty impactful and impactful in that really it gets a little emotional, but you're like, all right, for 30 minutes, I had a dad, like my whole life, I had one for 30 minutes, and the rest were, stand-ins and such. But
Yeah.
nothing
And
really replaces that little that little 30-minute snapshot. I probably felt more connected than all the stepdads and stand-ins, and even though there's been some amazing men who have filled that role voluntarily at different stages in life. But
this episode is brought to you by BetterHelp. BetterHelp provides access to professional counseling and therapists and lets you connect with the provider securely from your home, over video, chat, or phone, which I really love. You've heard us talk to so many guests who wish they could go back in time and tell their younger self to go seek therapy earlier and get the help they needed sooner, myself included. It's so easy to say that you got this and just keep pushing those demons inside, but they find a way out in the end. I promise you that. And when you're at your best, you can do great things. But sometimes life gets you bogged down and you may feel overwhelmed or like you're not showing up in the way that you want. Working with a therapist can help you get closer to the best version of yourself. So if you want to live a more empowered life, therapy can get you there. Visit betterhelp.com/combat today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/combat. And if you do this, you're helping the show out as well. So please take a look at this. And now back to this combat story.
anyway, so I always got a heart for that. But I say childhood was normal. In retrospect, it probably wasn't very normal.
No.
But it did really make me tough, I think. So I indeed was a fat kid, like no kidding, absolutely unathletic, total fat kid. And I say that because I love fat kids, Even when I was in the best shape of my life, I'm like, I still got a fat kid heart. Which when I say that, that just means more of people have had to deal with that in their lifetime and didn't grow up athletic studs and high school All-Americans and all that. You have a different perspective on life and treat people differently when you kind of know, where they're coming from and hardships and all that kind of stuff. So,
And you said you got bullied quite a bit, no?
oh my gosh, all the time. So this little farm town in Galesburg, because it literally is a little farming and railroad town. And when in books and movies stuff, when they talk about, well, on the other side of the tracks, there was literally an east-west railroad line, the Santa Fe Railroad line, and on the north side of the tracks was all what you think of in the Midwest, the brick streets and the big pretty houses and all that kind of stuff. And then on the south side of the tracks, it was like straight ghetto, and it still is to this day. And I don't know why, but it was a very definitive geographic line. And at the time, in between whatever step we were always pretty poor, so of course we lived on the south side of the tracks. And my mom and stepdad number three, we'll just use them in numerical sequence. Stepdad number three, they bought this house on the south side of the tracks. And and while it was a fairly normal period, I had a mom and a dad and a sister, and we lived in a house. But I was the only Caucasian kid in the entire neighborhood. So every single day, it was a fight. Whether I got up, the rare times I rode the bus, it was either a fight on the bus or a fight off the bus. And I say a fight, it wasn't like I was doing much, I was just getting beat up all the time. Or they got pretty manipulative, kind of like predator and prey, or, hey, you want to come play? And of course I want to come play, because that's what kids do. And then they'd like go down the house and I get surrounded by five of them, get beat up, and then go back, crying. And so, I was too young. Like I said, I didn't have a dad who was really helpful, or because if that were me, I'd have been down there and set some houses on fire. You know,
Jeez, man.
that's what I'd do if my kids were that. If my kids had that happen to them, but there was never anything going on. There was never any defense or anything like that. So while I took a beating, it did instill something in me. One, to this day, it's a visceral red hot button for bullies. Like, man, I can't help it. Sometimes my wife actually has to pet me and stop me, because if I see it in public, I mean, I'll stop a car and get out and just unload on strangers for being bullies, or being
Yeah.
mean to pets or something like that. Like I can't help it. And I realize now, after lots and lots of therapy, I mean, like it's something from my childhood. I just cannot tolerate, bullies. And anyway, so it also, as I got older and stronger, it also made me a pretty good fighter, and I ended up taking boxing lessons and wrestling, and made me a super, super angry football player. Went on to play college football and stuff. So there was a lot of good things that came out of that, but boy, at the time, there didn't seem like there was anything good that would come out of it.
I got to say, one of the things, having interviewed 115 people now, vets, a very, very common denominator is this hatred of bullies from some experience as a kid. And I don't know if that's everybody in the world, like all American and not even Americans, like the Brits and Aussies too, who I've interviewed. They just have experienced something as a kid that makes them hate bullies. So when I was reading this, I was thinking that sounds pretty normal for our background, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's one thing to develop that professionally of, I hate, whatever. I hate seeing Taliban be mean to kids and women. I mean, that's whatever motivates you, whatever floats your boat, that
Yeah.
totally works. But to have it rooted in your deep rooted in your childhood, is a fire that I'm not sure ever really goes away. And while the older and grayer and, fatter I get, it may start dying off a little bit, but it's pretty close to this, it's pretty close to the surface. It doesn't take much.
Oh man. Hey, let me ask you this. Because of the way you experienced the male father figure in your life or the lack thereof, I feel like you are one of the very few who has had a wife for 30 years. I think, as you had mentioned, you got three sons, I believe. How did that experience growing up influence the way you are as a parent or a husband?
So I knew, as good as my mom tried to make it, I knew from a young age, like, this sucks, because when I started hanging out with other kids from school, I'm like, oh, so that's what a dad looks like. And,
Oh man.
and so again, at the time, I didn't realize it was painful. You only realize this as you get further on in life. Um, but, you know, my wife and I take walks now, which sounds like a very old person thing to do, but there is some of the craziest stuff that comes out from like my childhood and younger years and stuff on our walks, and I don't know why. But one of the things that I had told her was that I distinctly remember, probably like 10, like younger than you would think, us eating dinner. And, my mom, who's always trying to do the best thing for us. And we were at a restaurant eating dinner, and she said, whatever stepdad it was, no kidding. I remember saying, well, we could go with stepdad 3, but he's never really here, but he's really nice. Or we could go with stepdad 4. And he was here all the time, but he's not really very pleasant to it. Like, we're picking the lesser of the two evils at the time. And I remember telling her, like, mom, when I grow up, I'm going to make sure that I'm a better dad. I'm going to make sure that this never happens to my kid. Now, in my head, I didn't mean that to sound as offensive as it did. But of course, for a mom trying to do her best and all that, she completely burst into tears and, like, you know,
Oh.
I'm sorry, I'm not doing it to your specifications. So I didn't have the wherewithal back then to be able to conceptualize all that. But, that was a driver. Um, Amongst everything else, amongst getting bullied and wanting to do all the other things, I distinctly, or subliminally, again, after a heaping amount of therapy as I'm older, which has unpacked a lot of baggage. And so basically, what I did is I spent my life trying to create the dad that I wished, I'd have been able to look up to and make sure my sons are proud of me and all that kind of stuff. And it really was less ego centered than it was, I just don't want that pattern to be
Oh
recreated. And
man.
of course, like every other parent, as your kids are teenagers, like, holy cow, I'm going to kill them and my children are failures and all that kind of stuff. But now that they're older, you're like, okay, so they're probably not all, they're not all Ivy League graduates and all that kind of stuff. But, the basic citizenship stuff and how to treat women and take care of their families and be sheepdogs and all that. I'm like, that part, for some
I
reason,
got it.
so as we've deduced, all things considered in this day and age, that's the most important part, and they've all got that, and so we consider them a success.
That's great. I've got 3 sons as well, but we're probably 10 years behind you, so 10 to 15. So
It's
we're
it's
working on
rough.
that.
It gets
It
rough.
is.
Teen years
They're
are
good.
rough.
They're good kids though. They're good kids. So, you mentioned this upbringing, not easy. You also mentioned college football. Where does the Navy come in? Where does that glimmer start for you?
Well, a lot of people. I actually try and pay attention to when other guys tell their stories, and there's no shortage of them. And I just always knew there was never choice. I always knew from the time I was little, 5, 6, 7 years old, that I was going to be in the military. I mean, I didn't know at that time. I wasn't smart enough to know what I was going to do. I just knew I always wanted to be military, and I didn't break it down into jobs within the military. I just knew I wanted to wear a uniform and be in the service. Because at that time, this is like the '70s, mid '70s or so. Um, Television television was different because there was lots. I mean, if you really think about, sounds funny, but if you just think about sitcoms, all the Belisario sitcoms, it was Magnum PI. He was a SEAL and he was surrounded with the Vietnam guys. A Team, um, uh, Airwolf. I mean,
Yeah,
all the
yeah,
things that I watched. All the stuff that I watched had ex-military guys or military guys, and so you want to be them. Also, all the movies. I mean, I watched. That's when all the cool war movies were out, but they're all post World War II. Tora 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 and the Battle of the Bulge, and I mean all that stuff that I don't think anybody watches anymore. But that was my daily diet of stimulation. And of of the multiple stepdads. At least half or three-quarters of them had not military careers, but they were in the Navy or the Army or whatever. So, and all their friends were as well because they all came from a generation, not too far removed, where every male did their part and they did their term in the military, and that's just kind of the way it was, and that's obviously a bygone era. But everybody was in the military, so I was kind of surrounded with that. And I always wanted to wear a uniform. I mean, I was in Boy Scouts because it was as close to the military as I could get, and Civil Air Patrol and all that. So I mean, I just wanted to be in the military. That was a career for me. Um, Now early on, from 5 or 6, I really got hooked on flying because one of the stepdads, although he was a complete dirtbag, he did own a World War II biplane, a Stearman biplane, which I actually own now through a long series of processes. So I was kind of involved in that, and so I grew up on that. That's the only thing I knew was the Stearman and World War II airplanes, and of course, you can't really get that immersed in World War II airplanes without kind of getting sucked into the actual World War II history, and I
yeah.
mean, so you can't really do one without the other. It was just a tool during the war, and it wasn't just the airplane itself. So anyway, um, I mean, I was kind of inundated with it, which is odd from a little small farm town that it wasn't next to a military base, it wasn't next to anything. It's in the middle of nowhere, pretty much. Um, so how the Navy actually came into play was I was already hooked, to the point where I don't know. Do you remember the movie Taps?
Hmm.
The old movie with like Tom
Yeah.
Cruise and which didn't have a happy ending. But I saw that and I told my mom, I'm like, I want to go to a military academy for boys. I'm like, that's what I want to do instead of being in this sucky junior high or middle school that I'm in. And she told me, she's like, well, military academies are only for bad kids. You can't,
Oh
we didn't have any
man.
money for it anyway. But that's how bad I want to do it. I'm like, I'll go to a military academy instead of public school. Um, anyway, so it was easy because I think I was like 16 or 17 and Top Gun came out. So, all things were equal at that time. That was an easy choice. You got
Yeah.
to remember, like in the same 2 year period, Navy SEALs and Top Gun came out. I'm like, well, that's easy. I don't even have to think
Damn the
about
Navy, man, with their
it.
great
Yeah,
publicity.
but then the Army had Firebirds. So
I know. Come
what are you
on.
going to do with that? Yeah.
So why not go the aviation route?
Well, actually, I did, and which is there's so many stories within the story, and they all turned out. When I look back after 30 years, I'm like, man, if anything had actually worked out the way I wanted it to, I would have had a completely different, lackluster career. But I got told no so many times, and things went askew that it turned out the way it did. But so I had this silly idea in my head, like everyone, like every other kid at that time, like I'm gonna go fly fighters for the Navy. And of course, my grades sucked. I had all D's. I never studied. I was good at sports, and that was it. Sports and band is all I did. And so I actually, a good friend of the family who's now passed away, but he was a retired Navy captain, and he got me an interview with the local blue and gold officer, Naval Academy recruiter, and so I was so excited, having no idea what was actually required. And the guy was actually quite a jackass, but I credit him with stoking a pretty good fire. And I do remember I was in awe of him because he was an A6 intruder pilot, and he
Wow.
wore his uniform, and I'm like,
That's cool.
man, I was so excited. And then it was like the shortest meeting ever because I walked in. He's like, hey, go ahead and pull your grades. You've got a C minus, like whatever it was. You got like a 2.1 grade average. Your SATs are below average. He's like, you're okay at football. He's like, you're not really Naval Academy material. He's like, and to be quite honest with you, he goes, I'm not sure you're suited for career in the military at all.
Oh,
And,
funny.
as an 18-year-old kid, I'm like, okay, like, it's heartbreaking, but what do you say to that? A guy that you idolize. So literally it was about a 5-minute meeting. And I'm like, okay, all right, so plan B. So I went and, accepted the football scholarship that I had and went and did that. But that was just a placeholder. I mean, I was utterly, at that point, talk about rudderless, like literally and figuratively. I really didn't want to be there playing football. And, I was irritated with people and so on and got all kinds of trouble in college. Like I said, that was short lived. I was out before Christmas. Um, Shortest college career ever, and which was good because I did not belong there. Anyway, so that's and
And
so mid semester, I just went down. I didn't even ask my mom. I didn't tell anybody. I just went down to the Navy recruiter, who at that point I can't imagine it's probably the best time in history to
I
be a Navy
know,
recruiter.
except
Like
for
they don't
right
even have to
now with
look for
Top
people.
Gun Maverick. I
Oh
have a
yeah,
feeling they're doing pretty well now too.
oh yeah. And I just went down like everyone else. I'm like, I want to be a Navy fighter pilot. And I remember the guy laughing. He's like, yeah, you and everyone else. He's like, stand in line. He goes, we got an 8-month waiting list. And I said, no, I'm serious. Um, well, and I'll back up from that. So
Yeah.
I want to say in my junior year, and I don't remember how. I honestly don't remember how. I think it's because some girl I was in band with, her dad was like an army major at the local National Guard unit that had Hueys. I honestly, I wish I could remember now, but I don't remember. But I enlisted in the Iowa National Guard into this Huey unit, and they were doing this thing where you could go to basic in between your junior and senior year, and do a little bit. So I'm like, well, this is awesome. It's exactly what I needed. I wish I could remember how I got to that point. Um, you would think I would know like how I ended up enlisting. I mean, this is sometimes I forget about this. Um, so I enlisted in the Iowa National Guard, did a couple drills, got to sit in the back of a Huey and fly around Iowa, which at that point I'm like, that was about as good as it gets. Got to fly in a military helicopter and and then I remember it was somewhere in between junior and senior year. I was supposed to ship out for basic training, right? And I had always had breathing problems, like when I was a kid. And I don't remember what I put on the thing. I probably put no, I don't have any breathing problems or whatever. But that was everybody smoked, and I'd always be in the car with my mom, windows up, her puffing away, chain smoking, and what so, so many things. Anyway, so not thinking anything of it, I show up with basic training with like this inhaler that my mom gave me because and so when they do their little inspection and then they completely freak out and they're like, you're not qualified. So anyway, so I get kicked out of the Army National Guard. So then I'm done with that. And yeah, so I think I told you there's probably a dozen or more pretty pivotal spots, where I could end up, working at AutoZone or something like that instead of what I did. So my military career was over, and I was too dumb at the time to realize that. And then when I went in the Navy recruiter, and I said, actually, I went to the Marine recruiter first because they were all in a line in this little town.
Yeah.
Like, well, that's how convenient. I just go door to door to door. So the National Guard recruiter's office, and right next to that was a Marine recruiter. So I had no method except that it was right next door. And I walk in, and it was like something out of a movie. That sergeant was like hazing some poor dude on the floor or whatever. And I'm like, oh, I want to be a Marine. And and so I spent about 2 weeks with him, and he looked up the records and saw that the guard kicked me out for, you know, not qualified, whatever. And he's like, I'm not having anything to do with you. So then I always skipped the Air Force, and maybe even when I had, a diploma, but I did skip the Air Force office and went to the Navy recruiter's office. And I don't remember her name. It was this little female recruiter, back when there weren't a lot of them. And she was kind of mean. And I signed all of her stuff, and I told her, I said, hey, this is what happened. And she said, listen, in her crudest, I don't know what she did for a job. And she's like, listen, kid, I'm not fucking around. She said, I'll go through this pain and I'll enlist you. She's like, I'll go through the whole med pros and the med board and all that kind of stuff. We'll ride this whole train together. She's like, but she's like, but if your waiver gets approved and you don't enlist, she's like, I'm going to hunt you down and kill you. And she was dead serious.
Dude, how
And so,
fortunate that you ran into this person when so many others had passed on you.
oh yeah. And like I said, like physically and figuratively, it was the end of the line. And like I said, she was like a little, I don't know what she did, like she was yeoman or something like that, admin, but she was an angry little person. So, we went through like 4 months of all these preliminary tests and, all these, they paid for them all and I passed them all. Um, and then there was no ceremony or anything. There was no high five. It's like, here you go, sign every single one of these. She's like, this has been the worst thing I've done here. And I did. So I signed all the stuff. And so once the waiver part was done, she handed me off to another guy, another recruiter, to kind of finish the process of picking jobs and all that. And at this point, I'd been so concerned about just getting eligible to enlist in any service that I'd kind of forgotten about the job part because I always assumed, of course, somebody with a C minus average and no degree, they're going to immediately put me in a fighter, like they're screaming for that kind of talent. And, you know, and I say that in jest because those are the things that I had the audacity to think.
Yeah, you don't know, man, when you're that age.
Yeah, the world's your oyster. Um, so, so this guy's all right. Let's talk about jobs. I'm like, I just want to fly fighters. He's like, yeah. He's like, you can't really do that. At this point, nobody told me you couldn't do that. So he's like, but he goes, what I can do is I can sign you up for the NAVCAD program, which is Naval Aviation Cadet Program. And my details after 35 years now are kind of fuzzy, but they enlisted you and you went to some like OCS. They commissioned you an ensign, but you didn't have to have a degree. And you went out and did your initial tour as an aviator. And then, they sent you back to go to school. It was a pretty good deal. It was kind of like the Navy's equivalent of warrant officer aviators, as close as they had them back then. And it was a big program. So I'm like, oh, I'm all in for that. So I signed on the line for all that, and then I go back. This is while I was actually in college for that very short duration. And what was bad is that sparked the whole screw you, I'm going to go be a Navy fighter, blah, 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 blah. So like there's dropping those bombs everywhere and just leaving a path of destruction so I could never, ever return anywhere in that town. And then about 3 months before, if you remember the whole Clinton era, you're probably a little young for that, but when Clinton just decimated everything, and I got a call from that recruiter. He's like, "Hey, I just want to let you know the NAVCAD program has been suspended. He's like, not discontinued, just suspended. So, we can't ship you out right now." He's like, "So why don't you come on in and let's talk about your options?" And again, me having no idea, so we go in and it's not hitting me exactly what this all means. But he's like, yeah, you can't be an AVCAD. I'm like, I can't be a fighter pilot. He goes, no, you can. And he's trying to put like the best spin on it he can. He's like, it's not terminated. It's just suspended. Now, 3 months later, it actually did get terminated, never ever to return to the Navy. But he's like, but check this out, man. So we got to get you another job just so we can get you in the Navy and, get you going. He's like, and as soon as they bring that program back up, whatever jobs are in, they're just going to snatch you right out and send you to flight school. And I'm like I'm like, that's awesome. That'll be just, I'm like, I don't really care. Just send me whatever you got, I was like, but I want to fly. And so he's like, I'm going to make you a flight engineer. He goes, and it sounds cool. And I'm reading it, and all I cared about, I'm like, oh, I get to fly. I get to fly and I get to wear flight suits and having no concept of what that is. He's like, I'm going to make you a flight engineer. He goes, the pilots can't start until you tell them to. He goes, that's how important your job is. So I don't remember. It sounds funny, but I don't remember what I signed, and I should have, because I'm doing some reading. I'm like, oh, I'm gonna be on an S3 Viking catapulting off the carriers and blah blah blah, or all these cool airplanes. Never ever have I ever considered at that point being on a helicopter. I did not care for them. Like it wasn't exciting, and they certainly didn't have any in Top Gun except for the one that rescued Maverick and Goose. So I don't remember what I signed, but I get to Pensacola and I'm going through aircrew school and they're going through assignments and everybody's going to S3s, P3s, whatever, and they're like, and Rutledge, you're going to helicopter rescue summer school. I'm like, whoa, hey, time out. I'm like, I don't want to be on helicopters. That's not, and I wasn't an awesome swimmer either, which ironic, definition of irony, I'd only swam at like the Y pool in Galesburg, just enough to dog paddle. So turns out I'd signed some paper that said I hereby volunteer to be a helicopter rescue swimmer in the Navy. And even dumber than that, I'd X something that said I waive my right to the $2,000 bonus for enlisting or something like that. So I'm much smarter when I sign documents now. So anyway, I head off to Pensacola, Florida, which I did boot camp and then I head out to Pensacola, Florida to Air Crew School and Rescue Swimmer School, which was okay because, it was Pensacola and there's all kinds of airplanes and that was cool. So that was a very positive period. And then I went to Naval Air Station North Island, for advanced training on the CH-46 helicopter, which is where I met this girl who
Wow.
occupied all of my time, who ended up being my wife. She was a freshman in college there. And um, so, I mean, it turned out okay, but I kind of laugh. I'm like, I was never ever launching off of a carrier. What I ended up doing in Desert Storm was flying around in a CH-46, delivering pallets of mail and cheese balls and sodas to all the other ships in the battle group, which,
How we,
again, as a 19-year-old, was actually kind of cool. You
yeah.
know, um,
And the fact that it's a CH-46 with where you go in your career.
yeah. So I
Also
had
pretty
no idea.
amazing.
It was total subliminal, and I hated
Yeah.
it because I'm like, of all the other cool helicopters, again, I didn't choose a 46. I chose in the line of success. I'm like, well, I want the Seahawks, which were relatively new at the time,
Yeah.
or I want an SH3 or an SH2, anything but that goofy looking double rotor 46. And yet, there I was. And it gets even worse than that. Like I got told no so many times when we were in school and they're handing out assignments, right? Now you got to remember, my girlfriend at the time lived in San Diego. So where do I want to be stationed? San Diego. Like, how hard can it be? They have like 50 different squadrons there. I thought for sure, I'm like, they got 50 in Norfolk, Virginia. They got 50 in San Diego and like one or two in Hawaii. I'm like, chances are in my favor. So as they're going down the list, and San Diego, Norfolk, Virginia, San Diego, Rutledge, Guam. Are you kidding me? You know,
Ah,
I'm like the only guy in my class
you can't get farther away.
that goes to Guam. And I mean, yeah, I mean, when I look at it now, it is a pretty funny story. So I guess at some point the chronology of all these bad decisions and things that happened to me, which ended up being good deals, should probably, go on
Yeah.
record. But I'm like, how bad can it get? And it ended up being a positive experience in a lot of ways. I mean, it makes you grow up really fast, but um, some things that stick in my mind. I actually had a Marine rescue swimmer in my class with me, and he was an idiot. But I remember when I'm sitting there looking at my orders to Guam, crying. That was before computers even, like tears in my eyes. I'm like, oh my gosh, how am I gonna break this to everybody? I don't even know where it is. And he goes, well, Guam's got a very very tasty food there called lupia. And I'm like, shut up. That's not what I want to hear right now. Um, so I went to Guam for 3 years, and went there and did one deployment right there, like kind of as Desert Storm was ending, and then turned right around. I can't remember how many months we were on the island, but turned right around and went to Somalia, and I can't even remember what flat top we were on, but kind of
Again,
supporting.
doing the rescue.
Yeah, but not understanding, and in my 19 or whatever it was 20-year-old mind, um, I didn't understand all the things that were going on shore. I just knew we were flying back and forth, Mogadishu, dropping stuff off and whatever, but not fully understanding the gravity of what was going on. That just kind of shows how immature I was, or I guess my helicopter and what I was doing that day
Yeah.
was the only thing I was really concerned with. Um, so didn't
Were
play a
you there
huge
during
part.
Black Hawk Down, Mike?
Yeah,
Wow.
but
Do you
not again, but
remember?
not knowing, you know what I mean? Like offshore, you really don't know.
Yeah. Okay.
That's when the seals are going over the beach and all that, but none of that. You know, we were on an amphib, and I think it was an LHA. I don't remember which one, but and I do remember like all the guys jocking up and going in the well deck and all that, and moving out. So again, thinking it's cool, but not knowing exactly what all is going on. Again, before the age of computer, social media, so
Yeah. You have no idea.
information. You talk, like an E4, your scope of what you can grasp is pretty small. Like I said, my helicopter, whatever I was doing that day and what I was eating was about as much as I was concerned with, which fast forward, gives me people, I always forget it, but people are like, oh, what do you think about the turds in the military today? I'm like, dude, your average E4 today is so much better trained. And so, I mean, so much more aware of everything that's going on. I mean, I got it. They got their head stuck in TikTok or whatever, but
Yeah.
holy
True.
cow, are they smarter than we were when I was an E4? People forget that. I mean, holy smokes.
Do you have
Um,
any along the way? I mean, we're going to get into this crazy career that you have in the elite of the elite. Um, are there any regrets that, man, I could have been flying jets if I had just done something else?
I occasionally will like, well, if I'd have done this different, it goes all the way back to maybe if I hadn't been a turd and actually studied in school or something like that. But I have absolutely no regrets because the way it turned out, which was not at all, I had no plan whatsoever.
Yeah, clear, not
All
this
I did,
route.
like, I mean, I had plans when I got into things, and then when I got in there, then I made another plan for the next stage or whatever. But I did not have that 30 years planned out the way it was at all. Um,
Man,
as I tell people, I'm like, all I did was when I got somewhere, I literally kind of looked around. I'm like, all right, what opportunities are available? Like nobody gave me jack. I always make that clear. I'm like, dude, nobody gave me anything, not monetarily, not breaks, not, the most I ever got was here's an opportunity. Should you choose to take advantage of it? And that was truly like every single stage, which got me out of helicopter combat support squadron 5 in Guam and to SEAL teams. So as soon as I got there, we just got back from Desert Storm and we worked with some SEALs there and of course Somalia. I mean, we saw them around those and the force and recon guys and stuff on the ship and so on. And I ended up doing I think 3 pretty long deployments in the 3 years I was there. But I mean, I was like a year in my very first deployment, which was to the Philippines. I actually took the PT test to go to Buds with some very legendary frogmen, which is a humorous story in and of itself. And they just totally abused me. And I put in my packet, and then the Navy said, no, you need to finish out your 3 years. We're not going to let you, leave early. Because you got to remember, I was also trying to get back to my girlfriend in San Diego. So I'm like, dude, I'll sign whatever you want. I'll take whatever abuse you have if I can get back to San Diego before, not have to wait out this 3 year requirement. Um, but Guam had Naval Special Warfare Unit 1, which is still there now, which is kind of like a clearinghouse. All the platoons and stuff will rotate through there and kind of filter out to different AOs, for different things. So there's no SEALs necessarily based there. They just kind of it's a routing system. And so one day, one of the just flying around Guam, they said, "Hey, we're gonna drop some SEALs, doing cast and recovery or something like that out of the helicopter." And I just remember being in the hangar. It's that Guam, 80 degrees, 100% humidity, just sweating like crazy, working on an engine, doing monkey work. And I see this 46 land, and the ramp drops, and these dudes walk off, bare chested, UDTs and boots on, carrying fins, long hair, all big muscles, and they just like this hangar that we kept meticulously clean. They just walk through just slinging sand and water and not a care in the world, just through the carpet and everything, and just walk out the front door into a van and disappear. And I don't remember who was with me. And some of those guys I still talk to. I'm like, dude, who in the hell is that? I'm like, oh, those guys are Navy SEALs. And now guys who want to go into SEAL teams and special ops and stuff, there's movies and there's all kinds of stuff on social media, and there was nothing back then. There was like tribal lore and whispering and there's just nothing. And so my motivation, despite what you hear some of the guys are like, oh, I've always wanted to be a Navy SEAL. I had no idea what it was. But I literally looked at this guy. I'm like, if those dudes are in our Navy, I want to do that. And I had no idea of anything else that they did. And I want to say it was like the next day or next week or something like that. I walked up to our career counselor, again, having no idea that they were going to say no. This was like year 1 or 8 months into a 3 year tour. And I didn't know that they would say, no, you
yeah,
actually have to finish out your contract. So I'm like, I want to be a Navy SEAL. And she's like, yeah, you can't do that. So like every 3 months, I'll be like, I want to be a Navy SEAL. Can I do that? She's like, no, you can't do it yet. And but that did stoke a fire. I'm like, all right, well, this 3 years has got to end somewhere. So I mean, from that day, I started preparing for it. And that was I would, as my wife attests to, when I get onto something, I'm absolutely 100% obsessive, and I can't let it go until I figure out every single detail. So you know, I mean, whatever boots I saw them wearing, I'd find some catalog and I bought the boots and I just start walking around barefoot in them so my feet would get tore up and running back and forth to the helicopters carrying these 30-pound toolboxes. I'd just be sprinting back and forth instead of walking. And, I had like the machine shop weld up a pull-up bar. So every time I'd walk back and forth from the helicopter. I'd do 5
That's
pull-ups.
cool.
Like, it was absolutely obsessive. But again, for a fat kid, I mean, I really wasn't. We skipped a lot of stuff there, but I was, to get to that point. So I mean, I knew at that point, I'm like, all right, that's what I want to do. Now remember, we're going to get back to it, but I came from a flying background. But after
Yeah.
that, I'm like, screw that. I don't want to fly anymore. I want to be a SEAL. And then I started finding lots of books. I say not lots of books. There wasn't a lot out there, but there was a book called SEAL Team One by a guy named Dick Couch, who was actually a team guy, and he wrote several other good books as well. And I read all of his books cover to cover. And then in the Philippines, at the Naval Air Station QB Point bookstore, this new book came out called Rogue Warrior by Commander Marchenko.
That's right. Yep.
So
I've
that
read
all
that.
happened like in that period. I read that thing cover to cover. I'm like, well, that's all the motivation I need. So I spent the remainder of that 3 years preparing for it. But that first deployment, which I think I was like 6 months, or maybe even not even that, maybe 5 months being on Guam, and they flew me on a C2. Actually, shut me off a carrier and flew me on a C2 to QB Point because that's where my ship was. It's where the detachment was. Landed in QB Point, and holy cow, so many stories. I told you I didn't have any stories, but there were some stories. Like,
Yeah, man.
I'm a
Go.
19-year-old kid, and they dropped me off in QB Point, which was just like the movies, total Wild West. And there's nobody there, and some Filipino E6 grabs me, and he's like, "What are you doing?" I'm like, "Oh, I belong to HC5." He's like, "Your ship ain't here. You got 2 weeks. Just find something to do." you know. So so I'm like, I don't know what I'm doing. Like I was pretty at that point. I'm like in another country, and I'm kind of scared, and nobody's in charge of me. So this guy takes me to the barracks, and the barracks were nasty. Everybody had doors and windows open. There was no air conditioning in the middle of the jungle. Um, and anyway, so he sits me in this barracks, and they just got whatever AFTV. That's it, your two channels or something, and that's all there was to do. I'm like, what am I gonna do for 2 weeks? And I don't remember what this guy's position was, but he'd come and check on me like once a day, make sure I was alive. He's like, you need to eat, man. Go eat some chow, do something. And I just sit there and watch TV, and he's like, you go play ball, go do some damn thing. You got to get out of here. So, I walk around, and of course it's a third world country, totally scared to death. And anyway, so I spent that 2 weeks basically hiding, and then my ship came back, with a detachment came back, with the two helicopters on it. And that ended up being, that was the remainder of the Desert Storm deployment. But one of those things that I lined up on my own, didn't tell anybody, got in trouble for it as a screaming E4, was I actually walked down and found the Naval Special Warfare Unit 1, which now is in Guam, but it used to be in QB Point, Philippines, until they closed it. And I just walked in. I didn't know how dumb I was. I just walked in. I'm like, hey, Chief. And the guy looked at me, and he was like straight out of Vietnam, like big old bushy handlebar mustache, like big long mullet, back when they could have it. And he was just wearing a blue T-shirt and UDTs and like drinking coffee. It was like something out of a movie. And he threw some expletive at me or something like that. And I said, Chief, I'd like to take the test for buds, the PT test for buds. And he just looked at me and goes, come back tomorrow morning at 6:30. And that was it. There was no, and I like handed him all my paperwork that I just filled out. And so I showed up I showed up the next morning, and he puts me in a Jeep because they still drove Jeeps back then. He puts me in a Jeep, or I do the push-ups and the sit-ups and the pull-ups, and not a word from him. And he just puts me in the passenger seat of a Jeep, drives me to the corner of the bay, like literally the corner of this bay. And I'd only seen the open ocean like 3 times. He's like, get in there, swim to that buoy, and then swim back. And it's like swim to this buoy, and the seaweed, kelp, and dudes zipping by and all kinds of different boats and stuff. Like no safety boat, no nothing. And I come back and I get out, and he's like, I forgot to make you run. Just get your boots on and go do your run. And I think it was a mile and a half run. And same thing, it was something out of a movie. There's what they call little bot buses, little Filipino jingle buses and stuff, zipping back and forth, and military vehicles, and no speed limit, dirt road. And he's like, you're going to run around this block 4 times, and that's a mile and a half. And he just sits there reading his paper and drinking his coffee. And I come around the last bend, and he starts yelling off times. And probably like 30 yards from the end, this bot bus comes out and like clips me, like knocks me on my feet, knocks me on my butt. I roll around in the dirt because I got no shirt on. I get back up and I start run back. And he goes, you passed by 2 seconds. And that was it. Like, not a word. He goes, get in the Jeep. And so we get in the Jeep, drive back to the office, and he signs this paper and hands it to me. And that was it. And so that guy's name at the time was Chief Dave Schmeck. And it's only cool because fast forward 6 or 7 years, I was at SEAL Team 1, he was at SEAL Team 3, and he retired from SEAL Team 3. We were right next to each other. And so I went to his retirement, and I laughed. And I ran into him a couple other times where I'm like, Chief, do you remember me? He's like, you look stupid just like all the rest of them. I mean, he was like a grumpy Mike. Don't you remember? I said I was in QB Point, at Group 1 there, and you gave me my PT test. He goes, oh yeah, you're the one that got hit by a bot bus. So that's what he remembers out of that whole thing. But talk about a cool circle. But I got to go to
Jeez.
his retirement. Anyway, so
Mike, did you ever go back to Guam as a SEAL?
oh yeah, I did for 2 deployments
What was
in
it like?
less than a year after I left there. Probably a year and a
Really?
half after I left
Oh,
there.
geez. Okay. Was it like just surreal to be back there? Like, oh my
Kind of
God, I
well,
made it.
I actually hated like the experiences were cool, but I hated the island. Like I was not a fan of the island. Again, I wanted to go anywhere.
Well, your wife
But
wasn't there. Like, you're on your own. You were
no,
young. Yeah.
yeah, it sucked. I didn't, Now, when we were dating, when I was at HC5, I mean, what little income I had, I either flew to San Diego or she flew out to see me, or something like that. So as often as finances would allow. But when we were on Guam, we were really on Guam in the SEAL teams. We were there for 2 or 3 weeks, and then that was before 9/11, and then after 9/11, of course, things changed drastically. But we went to Philippines for a couple of weeks, or back for 2 weeks in clean gear. We go to Malaysia or wherever. So it was really just a jumping off point. So it wasn't like you were enjoying the beauty of the island and scuba diving and stuff like that. It was pretty busy, um, but it was kind of funny because a lot of the guys that I had left from the helicopter squadron were still there. You got to remember, it was only maybe a year and a half that I was back on Guam.
Yeah.
Now, don't think for a second that I didn't, have my UDTs and tried it on and stuff and go do like the strut through the squadron. I'm like, hey, what's up, jackass? Remember me? Remember you telling me I couldn't do it? I mean, there was a little bit of that going
Yeah.
on.
Man. And how
But yeah,
great
it's
that Schmeck
pretty
gave
interesting.
you the PT test. Like, I assume he probably didn't have to do that.
No, he didn't. But I mean, like everybody else who could say no, what do you do? I mean, that theme has repeated itself, dozens of times throughout my career. What do you do when a kid shows up and says, um, "Hey, I'll do anything to take this test. Here's all my paperwork. It's all done." What makes it hard for you to say no.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
You got to make it hard for him to say no. I like
yeah,
that.
that's why I say you make it impossible for him to say. All you got to do is stand there with his cup of coffee for a half an hour.
Yeah.
So
God, that's
anyway,
cool.
there's that's why I say like I don't have a ton of there I was, Bin Laden in my sights kind of stories, but man, there are some funny just occurrences that probably do merit recording because they didn't happen by accident, but none of it was planned and none of it turned out the way I wanted it to, and most of the successes were born out of utter rejection and failure.
Well, I mean, that's the whole reason we do this is
Yeah.
for the crazy stories, whether they're no shit, there I was, or the funny. Um, I
I
mean,
got
take
some
me
of the no
through.
shit ones too, but the bulk of it's filled in with just other stories like that.
I mean, we can go a lot of directions from here, Mike, but I'd just be curious, like, if you could take me to the first time you are outside the wire in a hairy moment with the teams. If it was that post 9/11, you said you did one
Well, it was
tour.
actually during 9/11, and for better or worse, all my time in the teams was when there was no war going on. I mean, our deployments, we did lots of contingency stuff, lots of reconnaissance and stuff like that, but no in enemy held territory, that kind of stuff, but nothing, nothing direct action. And so 9/11 was the first time, that any of that stuff really took place. And I can tell you, there is absolutely nothing more destructive than being in a special operations team. I don't care if it's the Ranger Regiment or a Special Forces ODA. there is nothing worse than being a team guy with no war, because those are some dudes that will tear the most shit up for absolutely no reason. And if there's nobody to fight, we'll fight each other. So in some respects, the war was probably a good thing because it gave everybody something to focus on. And it wasn't like tearing bars up and fighting each other. So that was a good thing. But um, so we were actually doing a recon, like an unconventional warfare recon in Sri Lanka during 9/11. And we were a small platoon, and we were holed up in this nasty little motel. I say a hotel in the jungles of Sri Lanka because it was kind of close to where we were watching some harbors and stuff. And so we were doing the civilian clothes thing, and we had one room that had all the radio gear in it, all the guns, and there's the Tamil Tigers and some other. There were some pretty nasty groups in Sri Lanka at the
Yeah.
time. Um, so we were hanging out, go back to this motel every night, and it had one little like 6-inch black and white TV in the lounge. And so we're all sleeping with our weapons every night and stuff, not like hugging them, but just kind of ready to go. And I just remember walking by and seeing two or three of the other dudes huddled around this little TV. I'm like, what the hell's going on? And it was the BBC saying, aircraft have struck the World Trade Center, and other aircraft have struck the Pentagon, and so on. And that was like there was no message traffic coming through. You got to remember, like, there was barely any email or anything. All we had was like secure satellite messages or something like that. There weren't any emails or anything. Um, and so that was the only way that we knew what was going on. There really wasn't a whole lot of information. But on the secure side, immediately they're like, hey, pack up. We're going to get you back. We need everybody to get back, kind of reconstitute and head out to different areas. And so immediately on 9/11, as you can imagine, all the strategic airlift all around the world was either stopped or utterly focused on getting out the big, spooling up the 101st, spooling up the 82nd, all the Marine Expeditionary Units, so all the airlift was utterly focused. They were not concerned about an 8-man team stuck in the jungle of Sri Lanka. So there wasn't like active combat. But the next thing we see, the BBC is giving updates. And so every day we're just, all right, so all of our stuff we're doing stops. We're just basically make a bunker out of the hotel and just stay there till we figure out what we can do and get out of there. Because there's not that many ways to get out of Sri Lanka. Air is the only way we can get out because we weren't far enough. There was no way to travel to the coast. Anyway, so I remember seeing on the BBC, we're sitting there watching it, and the guy's like going through this world map of where all the U.S. forces are. He's like, and in Sri Lanka, there's a SEAL team, blah blah blah. Or he's
What?
in Colombo, Sri Lanka, there's a SEAL team. What? Are you kidding me? And so our platoon chief at the time, I was a platoon leading petty officer, and the platoon chief at the time, he's like, dude, everybody, back your shit up now. Let's go. And so everybody's rushing back. We wouldn't have that much stuff anyway, but we're trying to, load all these big stainless steel cases into like these two little minivans we had. And we're walking through, and no kidding, not 45 minutes after they came out, these Indians, we don't know if they're bad guys or whatever, going to the desk like, what are the Navy SEALs? What they do? And because it's not hard to pick out 8 or 9 200-pound Caucasian guys in the middle of the jungle in Sri Lanka. I mean, it's not, probably everybody knew something was up, but they didn't care until this came out. So anyway, that was like a 3-day period after that. We were just constantly on the move, because we'd go one place. And so what ended up happening was the ambassador we find this out after we get back to Guam and start packing up to go what we're going to do. And so apparently the ambassador of Sri Lanka was so excited to let everyone know that he had some Navy SEALs in his country. And he was, utterly excited to contribute to the effort and all that kind of stuff. So he was just feeding the BBC, yeah, I've got the guys moving here and they're over here, and these are the kind of weapons that they've got, and
What?
yeah. So I'm sure that was probably his last month as an ambassador.
Oh my
But
gosh.
that kept us on. So we kind of got started getting chased around the country until ultimately we had some MC-130s that came in. We had to set up the whole perimeter and kind of secure this airfield to get on this 130. And there were some dudes, kind of chasing us around, but not dumb enough to actually unload, because we still had guys walking around with M60s and grenade launchers and stuff like that. So we were prepared for the worst. But two o'clock in the morning, this Talon lands and doesn't even just drops the ramp and just start taxis slow, and we putting trucks in reverse and just throwing boxes onto the ramp, and it
That's
takes off.
awesome.
Yeah, so that's how we got out of the country, and that was our first. That was kind of our first taste of, okay, this is more real than just what we were watching on that 6-inch black and white TV.
Jeez.
Yeah, so I did not get to see any really, any combat as a SEAL team, because as soon as I got back, and it took us probably 2 months, obviously with the airlift and all that kind of stuff. It took us 2 months to get back to Guam, and of course everything's in complete disarray like it is everywhere else. Um, then they finally got us back to San Diego, and then they said, well, hey, it kind of got oh, you're too valuable. You've got all the air stuff, so we're going to have you help push these platoons out. We've already got them set. These guys are going to CENTCOM and so on. So the 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 reason I didn't get to go do any other deployments with the SEAL teams is during this 6-month deployment prior to 9/11, I had actually submitted my application to go to Warrant Officer Candidate School to be a helicopter pilot. So on top of that, as soon as I got back, um, it was waiting for me to transfer to the Army. So I mean, it was good timing, but then it was like, God, dude, you're killing me. Um, I
So
mean,
what I wanted to ask you here, Mike, real quick. Well, number one, the guy who is the ambassador in Sri Lanka is a family friend of ours. So my dad did his career in the State
oh,
Department.
ooh,
So it's really funny that you mentioned that. I gotta talk to my dad because my dad is like, I mean, he was a Huey pilot. He loves the military, and then he was in state, so he's one of the few guys in the State Department with a military background. So he'll be like, "What the hell was Ashley doing?" Anyway, separate from that, where does the glimmer of like going to aviation come in when you're in the
so
teams?
well, prior to 9/11, we'd worked in the SEAL teams. We worked with 160th a lot. And at that point, I'm like, these dudes are pretty badass. And I'd never seen their Chinooks because it never made it out to the West Coast. They always sent Blackhawks, which were totally cool. We'd done some. They had some Little Birds. We'd done some urban work with them and stuff. And so I knew, you know, there's so many different facets that are going on parallel with that story. But so I knew that I'm like, dude, I want to fly those things. I want to fly black unmarked helicopters. Um, and being in SEAL teams at that point, I've been in teams like 7, 8 years, something like that. And so, you know, I was fairly senior. I'd already done an instructor tour, so in my, it takes about 5 years or so to kind of quit being a new guy. So I'd gotten to the point where, I was fairly accomplished, had a good reputation, and could have gone on, and spent the rest of my career in the SEAL teams. But I saw these black unmarked helicopters, and that completely, like something shiny in the water. I'm like, dude, I want to do that. Now, combined with that, at the same time, um, I was flying as a civilian and flying a lot and spending a lot of money doing that. So, I went and got my own private instrument commercial license, multi-engine. I was towing banners. I was towing
Wow.
gliders. I'm like, and it gets further down the line, but earlier, I mean, I always wanted to be a crop duster since I was a little kid. This whole military 30-year thing kind of got in the way, but I'd always wanted to be a crop duster. So I was flying tail airplanes, and anyway, so I spent a lot of money on it. My wife at the time was actually a federal pretrial and parole officer. So she was a federal officer in GS something. And I was so stupid, I never paid attention to what she was. Turns out, she was like a GS 7 or 8 or something, which was a big deal at that time. And little did I know that my stupid little E6 paycheck was really just paying the utilities. You know what I mean? The big scope of
Yep.
things. But I thought, man,
That's
I'm
right.
making a lot of, we're living in Coronado. I'm making a lot of money. Well, I was spending all of my money renting airplanes and taking lessons and all that kind of stuff to the tune of like $25,000. Anyway, our our son was born. Our first son was born in 2000, and we made the decision. The two of us said, "Hey, she's going to stop working." Again, I'm like, absolutely, no one's going to raise our son. Blah blah blah. We're going to do all the cool stuff. Never in my mind was this panning out that there was income attached to that. So when she stopped working, and she's like, "Hey, we can't be spending $1,000 a month on flying anymore." I'm like, what do you mean? So that would hit hard, and that's how dumb I was. I didn't realize. I'm like, well, this gravy train will just go on. I'm like, I'll go be a crop duster, or airline pilot, something like that. So I was doing all this while I was in the SEAL teams before 9/11. You got to remember, there's no war on, so
Yeah,
you
it's
kind of have
different.
some pretty ample, you kind of have some pretty ample bandwidth to do other stuff in between deployments. So I had to make a decision. I'm like, and of course, the whole aviation industry completely came to a screeching halt. I was too old. I was actually 28 at the time, or 29, I can't remember. Too old for Navy flight school. Still didn't have a degree. So I called up, one of my 160th buddies. He's like, "Oh, dude, the Army will take you." He's like, "The Army will waiver anything," and so which is true, at that point. Um, so he put me in touch with the 160th recruiter because, of course, I'm good enough to go to the 160th, having no idea what that actually entailed. And I'm like, "Yeah, I just want to come straight to 160th." He's like, "Yeah, sure." He's like, "I'll tell you what, why don't you just call me when you've actually enlisted or when you've actually going to go to walk school." He's like, "Better yet, he's like, just call me when you actually have a contract to go to walk school." So I'm like, "Okay, I'll do that." And I'm sure he had no expectation whatsoever of ever hearing from me again. Again, all there was email. There's barely any internet or anything like that, no social media. Um, anyway, so this is before that deployment going on 9/11. I think we deployed in May or something like that. So of the different places we'd went to, I started working on this the whole time I was working on this warrant officer packet. And we were in Japan. I don't remember where in Japan, wherever the Marines are stationed, that island that they keep getting booted off of for terror nuclear. I can't remember. You know what I'm talking about.
Yep.
It'll come to me. Anyway, so there was a Special Forces flight surgeon there, first Special Forces group. And so I went to him and I said, "Hey, I need to get a flight physical for this application." He's like, "Yeah, no problem, man." And he hooks me up. And so another side story, back in 96 or 7, my eyesight was really bad. I had like 2200, it was just getting worse and worse.
Wow.
Wearing contacts. And so the Navy had this pilot or this experimental program for PRK, for Navy SEALs and fighter pilots only. And they selected
Wow.
10 of us. So they take 5 pilots and 5 SEALs. And I was in that initial deal to get PRK. So I had almost given up on flight school and I'm going out of sequence. But I go in 15 minutes, I come out and I got 2015. I'm like, flight school, here I come. So the Navy did not get the benefit out of that because all they did was set me up for success so I could go to the
But I
Army.
will say there's probably a chance because it was a small group of people that something could have gone wrong with this experimental thing.
Sure.
I'm sure there's a lot of experimental units that haven't had great outcomes.
They could have scrambled my eyes, which I didn't
That's
know.
right. You're lucky, man.
Yeah. So I did this flight physical with a Special Forces flight surgeon. And on the questionnaire, this is one of those pivotal moments. On the questionnaire, it says, "Have you ever had PRK or LASIK or whatever?" And I said, "What should I put on this?" I said, "Because I had it." He's like, "They'll never." He's like, "Just put no." He's like, "They will never know unless they map the eye." He's like, "And nobody maps the eye." So I put no. Anyway, long story short, I get back. I got this, "Congratulations, you've been selected for walk school." This isn't like January or February of 2003, I think now, or
No.
2002.
Yeah.
January 2002, because I went to walk school and checked in July 4th of 2002.
That.
Yeah. So I went down to MEPS, they swore me in, transferred me over, all that kind of stuff, and prepared to move my whole family from the beach in Coronado, California
To
to
beautiful
Enterprise, Alabama. And I drove there myself first, and I drove through it like 2 in the morning. I'm like, my wife's going to divorce me, But again, once we moved there, it ended up being the best year of our marriage because, no stress. So to speed this along, the very first thing, as you remember, the very first thing they do in flight school is you got med week, right? So you go to the medical facility, and the very first thing they do is everybody gets their eyes checked. And I'm standing in this long line of this whole, whatever, 80 people, 80 or 100 flight school students. And the guy, the guy standing next to me, who was a buddy of mine, just happened to be stationed there at Fort Rucker, and he was an optometry technician. He just happened to be standing next to me. Anyway, so the lady comes out. She's like, "All right, blah blah blah, for flight school. The first thing we're gonna do is map the eye." And I look at this dude. I'm like, and they had the whole thing like, light sheet steel, all that kind of stuff. We're gonna kick you out, and they were serious about it then. I don't know if they still do it, but so this line is slowly moving forward. I told him, "I'm screwed." He's like, "Why?" I said, well, I had PRK, but I didn't put it on there. I said, the Navy did it. All right, hang on. He gets out of line, runs back in the office because he used to work there, and he came back and he's like, all right, come with me. And he pulls me out and takes me to this office, and there's a female colonel, and I could look her name up because I've got it written down. And I know she was, an optometry officer. And she said, so, Mr. Rutledge, I've been informed by Sergeant so-and-so that you would like to be enrolled in my experimental program. And she was totally like playing it, like he told her the whole deal, like, hey, he had PRK, he lied about it. And she was stern, and she said, I have an experimental program for PRK and LASIK students to continue on with flight school. I will provide a waiver, but you have to be enrolled in my program. And she listed off, are you willing to comply with this? I'm like, absolutely, absolutely. And this is no kidding. Whatever. As that line is moving forward.
Oh man.
And like my entire career is in the balance. And she's like, we'll deal with your lack of integrity later. She's like, you probably need to get this sorted out pretty quick. I'm like, yes, ma'am, absolutely. And so, she goes and talks to the lady in line anyway. So then they pull me out of line, and I skip that, and they move me to all the other stages. I wish I could remember her name because
that's great,
dude. That is one person of a dozen, but she could have, if she'd have done the actual letter of the law of the Army, she could have just set me packing to the needs of the Army right then and there.
That's crazy.
But she did.
That's crazy.
Yeah. And I did end up going to see her. I got enrolled in this experimental program, and went on to obviously have a successful career, no issues with the eyes or anything like that. But if she just said, nope, you're screwed. I mean, she could have ruined it, but she said yes when she couldn't have said no. And again, that's a recurring theme as well with several people.
Man.
And I kept in touch with her. She's got a technician that still works at Fort Rucker, and 20 something years later, occasionally I'll still run across and just say hi, hey, how you doing? And they remember me. Like, she's like, oh, I absolutely remember you. You were like the talk of NAMI at the time. So
wait, so were you going straight into 160th? You already knew that going into flight school?
No, of course I knew that because I'm a jackass. You know what I mean? Like, there was no other option.
You just believe that.
Yeah, of course that's what I'm going to do. I'm like, there's no other option. I'm not going to go do anything else. I'm just going to go straight to 160th. Again, having no idea the depth of experience and the quality aviators and all that. I just saw Black Hawk Down. How hard can it be? I mean, in my stupid head.
For people who are listening, Mike, like, it doesn't really happen. I mean, it's rare for that to happen.
It's very rare. It happens occasionally. But yeah, it's very, very rare. And the reason it's so rare is because it's so incredibly difficult to do because it's such a steep learning curve. But again, not knowing that, I was like, well, I'm a team guy. I can do anything. I can make anything happen. And I still believe that to some extent. But I often get myself in a position where I'm like, man, that sucked. I wish I'd have thought about that a little more. But so as soon as I got orders to walk school, I called the regiment recruiting officer, who I'm sure never expected to ever hear from me again. And I can't remember his name, Captain somebody. And he really sounded perplexed when I called him, at the regiment recruiting officer assessment office. And I said, hey, this is Chief Rutledge, blah, blah, blah. So I'm going to Fort Rucker. I'll be there July 3rd, and I'm thinking he's going to welcome me like, congratulations. We'll have your Black Hawk waiting for you at the regiment. He's like, yeah, why don't you just call me when you're done with instruments? He goes, if you make it that far. And that was it, man. Click. And of course, in my head, I didn't tell my wife this, who believes, that I can make anything happen. I'm like, dude, I just like completely canned, a career in naval special warfare, E8, like all that. I just got rid of all this, and I did not get the welcoming reception that somehow my immature brain thought I should have.
Yeah. Was there any regret, Mike, on your end that, like, while you're going through flight school again, 2002, 2003, like, oh my gosh, the teams, like these guys that you probably knew are going down range with the teams. I don't know, how was that feeling?
Especially when you start reading stuff on the news, when you start hearing about Robert's Ridge and all these other things, and it wasn't, there was no regret at all because I was so excited to be flying. Like truly excited to be flying. Because remember, we were paying X amount of hundreds of dollars a month or whatever to fly.
They're paying you to fly now.
Yeah, and I even told my wife, flew a Huey for 2 hours a day for free. And I come back, I actually did the math because then the internet was starting to smoke a little bit, like realized I just flew like $2,000 worth of Huey time today and didn't cost us a penny. Um, so it was beautiful. So there was a little bit of regrets and then like, man, the teams just got spooled up. All the guys that I left are busy. Um, but I mean, I was thoroughly enjoying flying,
That's
and
good.
like it was
Okay.
a big deal. Like that's where like the fat kid in me, my heart has always been in flying. I love the SEAL teams, and it was extremely rewarding. I mean, don't get me wrong, every day in the SEAL team sucks because the guys you're with are. I mean, it just does, because it's just a very competitive environment. Don't let anybody say anything different. And I'm sure it's the same thing in a Ranger regiment.
Is
Uh,
160th not like that, Mike?
it is, but it's a different mentality. It's I guess it's not in a room of 50 guys, not everybody is 220 pounds and complete raging, whatever they're doing. It's very, very intellectual, more so than people would give it credit. Um, there's certainly physical guys and very A-type guys, but it's a very cerebral, very intellectual environment. And to do the things that we do, with the success rate and the amount of planning and execution, I mean, it takes that kind of a brain. I can't always claim to have had that all the time.
Nah,
Uh,
come on.
but my experience on the operator side of it kind of hedged that a little bit.
Yeah.
Um, but it's just different, and and I hate to say it, but when I left, my executive officer at SEAL Team One, who had just left um, being squadron commander at SEAL Team Six, he's like, "Hey, Mike, I am happy you're going to go out there and you're going to do great things." He's like, "Just remember, he's like, if you're not a SEAL, you're SEAL support." And he didn't actually mean that literally, but he was like, "Just understand your mentality changes. You're no longer an operator. You are now, part of the mechanism that makes it happen." So he didn't mean that to be a dig. I mean, it sounds humorous. He was a little deeper than that. It wasn't exactly how it sounded, but it's true. And that's at the 160th. That's a whole mentality of why the 160th is successful at what it does, is because everyone there recognizes that we are not the center of the effort, generally speaking. We are there to make sure that helicopter full of assaulters, absolutely 100%, no fail, makes the bad people go away that night. No
Yeah.
excuses, no weather call, no maintenance issues. What I mean? So 100%, absolutely guaranteed. And that's not easy to do. That takes lots and lots of dedication, rehearsal, discipline, all that other stuff. So it's a different kind of person. So equally as strong, just maybe not in the manner you would think between being an operator and a 160th pilot.
And for people who are listening, if they heard the Al Mack interview, like they'll understand the role of the MH-47. But just to put a pin in to just like really solidify this point, a lot of what you did was flying assaulters around. Like you went from being one of those
Yeah.
operators to delivering them onto targets. So
As
you're still a
in,
part of
I
it.
left the SEAL teams, and less than 2 years later, I was in Bagram, Afghanistan as a co pilot, flying my first direct action with the best man from my wedding as one of the team leaders.
No way. All right, hold
Yeah,
it. Tell me this story, man. Can you just
from one of the SEAL
please
Team Six squadrons.
tell me about this story? Like take us through your first DA downrange.
Well, it was we finished Green Platoon at the 160th, which obviously I was flying MH-47Es at the time, and it's a lot. Like it's almost another podcast. Just we talked about going straight to 160th. Um, I had to dig my heels in to make that happen, but you can ask about that later, and we'll backtrack on that.
Okay,
But
got it.
so I'm in Green Platoon as a W1, straight out of flight school. My 200 hours of flight school, that's it. And everybody else that I'm with the exception of another guy who was also a very talented W1, and he was from the Ranger Regiment. Very cool dude. He's out now, but an equally talented aviator. And all of our peers in our Green Platoon class are all multi-thousand-hour, battalion, uh, brigade SPs, instructor pilots. Oh, I'm like, geez, like that's a hard crowd to be in. Um, so that was the first, honestly, that was the first time being in the company of those guys. I mean, I was still a punk. Um, I just couldn't get it out of me. But that was the first time I was really humbled and realized, like, all right, this is a different league. Like SEAL teams are easy because I say easy because you just have to be hard, um, and not in a dumb way, but it was easy and it was familiar. And at that point, it wasn't overly technical. But man, you go with 200 hours and you hop into an all glass panel
Yeah.
MH-47E and the missions, particularly that the Chinooks were executing at that time, all the long range, DAs and 00 weather, terrain following, and it was more technical than anything I had ever thought I could handle. Um,
And you're at
so
a
it was a
huge
lot.
deficit, like 200 hours versus a couple thousand
Yeah,
is
the only
for people who
thing that
don't
kept
know,
me,
it's
oh
huge.
yeah, the only thing that kept me alive in Green Platoon because I probably came very close, and Al Mack is one of those pivotal people. They were gonna, the instructor cadre would be like, dude, you're not cutting it, like you're great at like the actual flying part. I flew the aircraft very well, but the systems involved and the mission planning, I was way behind. As one W5 instructor pilot who ended up being a really good friend of mine, Shady Grady, who's a hilarious dude now retired in Huntsville, and he's from Alabama. He had this funny accent. He's like, the easiest way for me to explain it to you is if if this was a train and there's a train station, like that train's like really gone, and you're just sitting there at the station looking at the back of it, which was like his Alabama way of explaining that you're way behind the aircraft. So the only thing that kept me alive was, I had several hundred hours of flight time, like good flight time. I wasn't just, flying Cessnas around.
Yeah.
At the time I was flying Warbirds and towing banners. So I handled the aircraft well. I could fly it, but the systems and the mission planning, was melting my brain.
You also knew
Um,
airfields and airspace way
yeah,
better
so I
than
could
anyone
talk on the
else.
radio. I mean,
Yeah,
I
that's
could
a
do
help.
the tactical side of it. I knew what the ground force was doing and all that, but the tactical side of the MH-47, I mean, it's challenging. It's challenging for a seasoned aviator, and probably even more so now. Of the four platforms that the regiment flies, it's easily the most technically challenging. And we are known, MH-47 guys throughout the regiment are known to be the absolute geeks of the regiment, which is so not me. For a guy who can't do long division, it's pretty tough.
Oh, that's great.
I had some really good mentors and some phenomenal instructor pilots that said, "Hey, you suck, but we can get you there." So all
Damn.
that to say, going to the regiment as a W1 right out of flight school, the bragging rights are high, but it is a real, real challenge. Like I won't ever tell anybody I got nothing to brag about because when I got there, I got my ass kicked from the first day I was there, in actual mission training, until I graduated. And I mean, it took me easily 3 years, before I wasn't behind the aircraft to be a competent PIC. And I mean, it was significantly longer for me to get competent in the aircraft than it would have been had I been in conventional army and just done a tour career or something like that. So I had my hands full for sure. So I will never tell anybody that it was easy.
Got it.
The standards are and continue to be, excessively high.
Damn. So you somehow get through this, and then the
So yeah,
first mission you
good platoon
fly is
flight.
a dude you know is in the back.
Yeah. So we we graduate Green Platoon, check into our company. Got to B Company, Second Battalion, 160th there at Fort Campbell, and walk in the door, and they're like, first thing happens is all the crew chiefs beat me up and riggers tape a beach ball to my head. I mean, they beat the hell out of me for like 2 hours. So
Even
that
as a
was,
former SEAL, Mike, like you don't
yeah.
get a
Now,
shitload of street cred for that.
well, I think that was I got beat up because I was a punk. Now you got to remember, I was a helicopter crew chief before I went to SEAL
Yeah.
team, right?
All right.
So,
Right on.
so we were doing some dust landings, I think in Albuquerque or something like that. And one of the crew chiefs said, "Hey, you want to get up in the door and give it a try, hot shot?" So I did, and I called it in dust landing, normal stuff, and I sat down. I said, "You guys are overpaid." Now being sarcastic and thinking that's a joke, but that was like 2 weeks before the end of Green Platoon. And what that did was get escalated straight to the company SI, the company head enlisted dude. And so when I checked into B Company, I walked across from Green Platoon, walked across the street into B Company, my little beautiful blue uniform and this big hulking, and I still talk to him fairly frequently, and he's a cool dude. Um, and he was no kidding, probably like 260, 270. And I walked in, I said, "Hey, how you doing?" I said, I'm CW2 Rutledge, or I said, "I'm Warrant Officer Rutledge." He goes, "Oh, you're the guy who thinks we get paid too much." And then he just
Oh,
walked away.
that's bad.
Yeah. And so, so I walked in the first sergeant's office, handed him my stuff, and he looked at me and he just shook his head, and then the usual, and I don't think they do it anymore, but then I walk around the corner, walk into the pilot office, and it's completely empty. I'm the only one in there. And the crew chiefs that are still around, they tell some pretty funny stories, but they started flooding the room. And in my class A's, I start pounding crew chiefs, just slinging crew chiefs but eventually it just gets too
There's
much.
only so many you can take
Yeah,
on.
there's only so much. So I mean, I got a lot of street cred for putting some bruises on several of them, but ultimately they did tie me up and duct tape or riggers tape a beach ball to my head and left me there for several hours. And but after that, it was all business because there was a war on. We had to get
Yeah,
going,
right
and that
on.
was a statement. It was a welcome to the company, but that was also a statement. And it's not being gratuitous, but I ran into a lot of great people in the 160th, but some of the crew chiefs and enlisted dudes to this day are my best friends. And of course, one of
It's
them now is
awesome.
actually the regiment command sergeant major. But anyway,
How
it was an
how great
experience.
is that feeling though? Like
Yeah,
I think that's one of the best. The people that you knew when you were younger who are now in these command positions. That's really
yeah.
cool.
As I get older, it's kind of like being a dad. I get so excited when I
Yeah.
watch them become first sergeants and command sergeant majors and stuff like that. And it's pretty darn rewarding. So anyway, back to your original. We keep getting sidetracked, but so I finished Green Platoon, check into B Company after get beat up and all that. And they're like, "All right, you got 9 days, and you're getting on C-17 to Bagram, do your first rotation." So
Damn.
so it's not like the conventional Army where you go to your unit and you do an RL progression. The day you graduate from Green Platoon, you are RL1 in all environments: desert, decks, urban. Like you're ready to go. You may not have all the company SOPs down, but anyway, so
Just real quick, Mike, for people who are listening, RL is your readiness level. So you kind of progress from not knowing anything. And in the conventional aviation side, you'll take months to progress to RL1, basically. So you're saying you come right out of training and you have that.
yep, you're ready. You are deployable.
Got it.
Right out as soon as you check into your company. Um, So, Green Platoon was pretty busy. And then I basically had 9 days to kind of hug the wife and my little boy at the time, who was like a year and a half or something. And got on a C-17 not knowing what I was gonna do. And we've got the picture of me holding my little boy and my wife and heading off to Bagram. And so the C-17 lands, and I'll always remember the C-17 lands in Bagram, and it was July or something. And just that dusty, sandy, like I can picture it today. And that had to have been June of 2003, I think. Get off the C-17. It's just stifling hot. It's about 5 p.m. in the afternoon, and the C-17 stops in front of the row of MH-47Es. And I get off, like something out of a movie, get off my backpack and walking towards the little hooch at the end of the flight line. And the 47s are getting ready to launch. They got the customers coming out and stuff, and they get ready to launch. And the first person I see on the ramp of the helicopter is Al Mack, CW3 Al Mack. He's like, "Hey, Al, what's going on, man? A little busy, and that was the intro to Afghanistan. And I got like 3 or 4 days, I think, there, and went and did an LAO, flight just to get used to flying around Afghanistan and stuff. And then very first DA was with a SEAL Team 6 squadron, and I was so junior, even though I was a SEAL, it wasn't like I was talking to him or anything. I wasn't part of that planning process. Your scope of responsibility is so small. So I just basically went out the air. I knew who the customers were, went out the aircraft. I looked back, and Jerry, who's best man at my wedding, all bearded up and stuff. He's like, "Dude, what's going on, man?" I'm like, he's like, "Hey," and typical team guy's like, "Hey, don't kill us tonight, all right?" I'm like, "Yeah, I promise." And again, I was so stupid. There were so many things that I screwed up that first couple deployments, as a W1, but I was paired. They intelligently paired me with some super, super experienced
Yeah.
instructor pilots that saved me from myself, and so overcame that pretty quick, and came to be a pretty well relied upon assault pilot. But yeah, that was
Mike,
pretty.
what are some of the things that you may have messed up for people who are like, how is that possible? This guy just was a SEAL. He came through the 160th, like without many flight hours. What are things that go wrong in that deployment?
Well, as an aviator, I mean, dude, there are so many things that can go wrong in a helicopter so quick. Um, and Afghanistan, even worse than Iraq or any place else I've ever flown, the the hazards in Afghanistan are not necessarily the enemy. The hazards in Afghanistan are environmental. So the very first thing that I remember screwing up was, again, everything's an assault, so everything's real. There's no more training. And we were 3 or 4 in a flight of 4 on an assault. Went and picked, the infil went fine, picked the guys up, and we're in a formation. And as in those places, it just goes from clear blue at nighttime to everything's at night, never flew during the daytime. Clear blue to holy cow, we just went visibility went to nothing. And of course, we're in a formation, and Mack is leading. As a matter of fact, I remember this specifically because later on, when I was leading flights, I'm like, I'm never going to do what Mack did. Mack always led us into clouds because Mack is a legend and he knows exactly how to do it. But sometimes Al forgets that there's, you know, 3 other ships behind him that aren't nearly as talented. It was kind of humorous, like, dude, Mack will lead you into some shit you can't get out of. So we punch in. I don't remember if it was just fog or cloud or something like that, but so we punch in and everybody executes the invert, the formation invert and IMC plan, and everybody goes on the terrain following radar, right? We go in our separate headings, and I'm flying with a guy, and I wish I could remember his name because he was utterly patient and humorous, W4, and I'm again dumb W1. And so we're flying on the terrain following radar, which gives you a lateral pictorial representation of the terrain in front of you. And it calculates every few seconds, your gross weight, the pressure altitude, power available, and it draws a line and tells you whether or not you're going to clear the terrain ahead of you, like 20 miles ahead. So I'm fixated, like absolutely fixated on this thing. And I just see this terrain ahead of us. And it was like, 15,000-foot mountains. And we're just in a climb and a climb. And the guy in the left seat, the way we work it is he's preoccupied. He's working flight plans and talking on the 5, 6 different radios. All I'm doing is flying. Now, when it works perfectly, the guy on the right's flying and autonomous. The guy on the left is mission managing. Now that only works if you don't have a dumb W1 in the right seat, with a helicopter full of customers. So anyway, I see this train climbing, and of course, what do you do when you panic in a helicopter? You keep pulling power and pulling power and pulling power, and so we're climbing and climbing and I'm trying to get this cue to look correct, so it looks like we're gonna, and we're in the clouds, 0, 0, nighttime, and I'm trying to make sure that we don't smack into this mountain. But what I don't notice is we're going from like 120 to 100, to 90
Airspeed.
to 80 to airspeed. Yeah, and it's getting slower and slower. And then all of a sudden, on the master caution lights up, and you hear number 1 engine temperature high. And then preceding, he's like, hey, 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 what are you doing? He pushes his collector down, and then beep, number 2 engine temperature high. And he's like, damn it. At this point, the MH-47Es even were very, very high tech because everything's recorded. You're not lying to anything on that. Anyway, so we get through it, and we come out the clouds. The funny part was everybody bursts out of the cloud, and instead of being in this nice, neat little formation diamond like the SOP says we're supposed to be in, we laugh. There's like helicopters everywhere. We're passing each other on top and bottom. It worked, but it didn't work at all like it was supposed to. So we get back to Bagram, and of course I overtemped both, couple $1 million
No.
engines, both of them, and there's a timer, and I want to say from memory it was like 12 seconds. So that means I was holding that power in for a long time. So we land, we get our debrief done, and I'm feeling like crap. I'm like, dude, I just overtemped engines, having nothing to do with the cost of engines. But our maintenance dudes, who are the absolute best in Army aviation, I mean, as soon as we get off the aircraft, they're on it like 20 cockroaches pulling stuff off. I mean, they know they got to get a mission ready for the next day. I ended up being a maintenance platoon leader one time, and so I have a newfound respect. Anyway, so they're
Oh
working on
yeah.
it. So we get done with our debrief, and I walk back out, and there's an E7, obviously a maintenance E7 in charge of all this maintenance going on, and I walk out, and I'm like, hey, Sergeant, I said, I said I feel really bad about this. I said I would really like to help, and he's like, sir, I don't think they want your help. He goes, I think it's best you just turn around and go to sleep. He's like, because I don't think it's going to turn out well if you hang out here. So they were obviously, that was enough to know that, I'd pissed off all the enlisted guys.
Oh
So, I
Jesus.
mean, yeah, I mean, I did that wrong. Um, it's not pompous, but I don't remember a whole. I mean, there's a bunch of little things that I did wrong, um, but that was just like the first one that woke me up. Like, hey, this is real, and you can die really quickly doing this, having nothing to do with getting shot down. Um, so we just did assault after assault, and the 160th does it different than they're not any better than any other Army aviators or crew chiefs at all. They're just resourced to train to a different standard. I kind of take um, I can take any, when I was instructor pilot, I'm like, I can take pretty much any decent Army aviator. And if I give you unlimited flight hours and unlimited resources, I'm like, I can make you a 160th pilot. You just got to want to go through the hassle and the, what's the word for it? The experience of having to get to be that good.
Yeah, the pain.
Nobody ends up being that good being lazy. You have to want to. So, after that, learning curve was pretty quick, and I ended up being a pretty good assault pilot. I led some pretty large missions. Um, as a flight lead right seater, as a fully mission qualified pilot. So, like I said,
Mike,
quick
could you
learning curve,
talk through
awesome mentors.
could you talk through one, like, kind of one of these missions where you're the one responsible, you're planning, kind of what it's like from your perspective, the responsibility that's on your shoulders, how you feel about it throughout the flight, maybe one that has some challenges in it, so people can understand that.
Well, and again, I apologize because I don't have a perspective on how the conventional army or other sister services run their helicopter cockpits. I just know the way we do it, and MH-47s in particular. And it's such a complex aircraft, and the missions are so complex that the right seater is generally the less experienced pilot, co-pilot, if you will, basic mission qualified pilot. And the left seater, I'm sorry, the right seater is a basic mission qualified pilot. A left seater is a fully mission qualified pilot. Generally more experienced. And contrary to what other services do, the most experienced pilot is not on the controls. The co-pilot is the one who, by description, is always flying the helicopter, unless he needs help.
The least experience, the
Least
less
experienced
experienced
guy. Yep,
guy is
he is on the
flying.
controls. He's flying the helicopter. Um, all the sausage making or the meat and potatoes of it is going on in the left seat with the mission management because that guy is, he's running 3 multifunction displays, 6 radios, coordinating with the air mission commander. I mean, there's a lot going on in the left seat that has nothing to do with controlling the aircraft. So I mean, I say basic mission qualified pilots in the right seat. They're still highly qualified by Army standards. Just in the regiment, that's how we designate
Yeah.
positions. Um, so there are missions where the guy in the left seat, particularly in a flight lead cockpit, meaning you're leading the flight, the guy in the left seat never looks up. I mean, he's not worried about flying the helicopter. He's down there mission managing on radios because there's always things going on like, hey, how fast can you get there? How much weight can you take? Hey, we just had troops in contact. We got 3 wounded. How far away is the nearest Kazovac point? Can you get into this LZ? How high? I mean, it's just constant getting bombarded with questions and information. And a guy will spend a 4 or 5 hour assault just doing nothing but managing systems. I mean, depending on the complexity of the assault, it can be pretty mind bending. So he relies on the guy in the right seat to keep the aircraft upright and do what it's supposed to be doing. So when I say basic mission qualified co-pilot, it's not generally in the terms like we think
Yeah.
of generally in Army aviation. It's kind of a different grade. Um, so that's generally the way a flight goes. We'll brief a typical assault overseas during a combat deployment is, everybody sleeps. We wake up at 4 o'clock or something p.m., work out, eat dinner, whatever everybody else is eating for dinner, we eat for breakfast. Go to a brief. Sometimes they're deliberate missions. Sometimes we're just sitting there waiting for some intel to pop up. Whatever our customers are, the Ranger Regiment guys, SEAL Team 6 guys, agency guys, whatever. We're just kind of sitting there all night waiting to see what pops up, and then inevitably, right about the time you're in the middle of a movie and slowing down for the night, like, hey, we got the intel we need. He's on the move.
Let's
Yeah,
roll.
yeah, and then we'll spool up. And so within an hour of notification, at least on our part, the mission will be briefed. We'll head out to the helicopters and we'll be cranking it off to go do an assault. Invariably, it's always at 2 or 3 in the morning. Um, that's just the way it is. Um, so we'll launch midnight or something like that. Very rarely ever before midnight. We'll launch, go drop the guys off. They'll do their assault, whatever that's going to be. whether it works well or it's contentious and we got to come in and pull them out, or they're shooting or something like that, and we'll come pull them out, or we'll go logger at a FARP site somewhere, where they have fuel. Logger meaning we'll just sit there on the auxiliary power unit for hours. Sometimes we'll do it if they've got a long walk in. We'll sit there for like 4 or 5 hours, just with the APU on, just sleeping and but half listening. And then same thing. You'll hear, hey, LZ black, which means hey, we need to get picked up now. And we'll get that big Chinook will get spooled up in like 2 minutes or so, and we're off. Still sleeping halfway. We'll go pick them up. Again, whether it's we're going in under fire or we're going in and picking them up. Either way, it is pretty emotional because out there, it's always, like I said, environment is always the enemy. It doesn't even matter if there's no enemy at all. You always have to land in a 200-foot dust cloud with obstacles on uneven terrain in a compound. I mean, just it's I fully always feared the environmental impacts in Afghanistan and other places far more than getting shot down. Like it was always, you knew every single night it was going to suck. There's no way about it. But I say my best deployment. It was the best and the worst. But I flew with the same guy. I was actually in the flight lead aircraft, and I was in the right seat. And I was actually a fully mission qualified pilot at that time. And the flight lead, guy named Ed, who to this day is a super, super friend of mine and just a good, very calm guy. And, when you fly, I think it was 360 hours and 90 days together. And, we did an assault every single night in 90 days that there wasn't bad weather. As long as they had ISR and you could actually get information, we were doing an assault. And, obviously there's some pretty severe acute fatigue going on every single night. But man, we were hitting them until finally our customers at the time said, all right, we're going to take a few nights off. We've pretty much burned the entire area out. They're like, there are no more Taliban in this region. Of course, I was pretty junior. I was W-2 at the time, so I didn't have all the political wherewithal of what was going on. We just knew we were assault this target, assault this target, assault this target. But you build some real cohesion, and we got to the point where Ed never looked up. He never touched controls on some of the hairiest landings that either of us have ever done. Both under fire and just with the dust and stuff. We almost crashed a couple times. It was hairy, but the trust that he and I had between each other, he never ever touched the controls or said a word. He's like, your job is to fly this airplane. He goes, because I have to focus on what's going on in here and running the battle. And once we had that down, it got to the point where he'd be mission planning in the planning room and I'd go get his dinner because I knew what he liked. I'm like, oh, tonight's cheese curd night, So, we had that kind of relationship, and we had to, particularly for that 90-day period. It doesn't always work out that way, but, we kind of built that relationship, and we did some pretty hairy assaults. But it's intense. And, people think, well, you only did 60 days, you only did 90 days. But what a lot of folks don't understand is the way the regiment does business. And it may change now. I don't know. I've been out long enough, but, you'd show up for a 60 or a 90-day rotation, and there's no days off. There's no, none of that going on. Every single night that there's not bad weather, you are doing an assault every single night. And so, your body and your attention span and your health can only keep up with that for a pretty finite amount of time. And I know the regiment doesn't do 90-day deployments anymore, because they realized, yeah, that's too much. So I think the most they see anymore is like 60. But so they say, well, you only did 60 days. Yeah, but it's a rough 60 days.
Actually, to that point, Mike, you're one of the few people who've been an operator and you've been in the cockpit. When you hear about folks who are like, yeah, there's crew rest and they need this time, like, how do you process that?
Well, we actually stuck very close to conventional Army crew rest stuff. We have provisions in the regiment's SOPs that said, if you need to fly 16 hours, you're going to fly 16 hours, and here's how we're going to do it. They mitigate the risk, but there's provisions in place to do what you need to do. And generally, not to be dramatic, but generally where that comes into play, which did in actually a big mission that I did with Mack, Where that comes into play is troops are in contact, the battle's going longer than they planned on. It's going out of darkness and into daylight hours. Things are getting hairy. And, the regiment is absolutely never, ever going to leave anybody on the LZ, ever. It doesn't matter what's going on. So, to that end, we have SOPs in place. Like if we have to go do it, we're going to go do it. We say we never fly in the daytime. It's not preferable because that's the most dangerous time for us to fly. And there's always a premium on black unmarked helicopters, in Afghanistan and Iraq. But that doesn't mean that we're not going to come get the customers if it runs into daylight. And, some of our most harrowing and heroic moments have come from having to do just that.
Can you take us through one of the more contentious either infills or exfills you experienced, whether, it was enemy fire, it was tough terrain?
A little known, and I think I gave you a little indication of it. And what's funny is it's not a mission that anybody's ever heard of, but you hear some references to it every once in a while. Obviously, I have to be vague enough to not get too deep into it. But 4th Battalion was brand new in 2007. I was a brand new FMQ. I had just finished my fully mission qualified check ride. And 4th Battalion, we had the new MH-47Gs. They were just fielded. We were the first ones in the 160th to have them. 2nd Battalion or 3rd Battalion didn't have them yet. And so we were the very first ones to take them to war. And in Al Mack's book, I can't remember what chapter, but it says, MH-47G goes to war. And so we took them, we were the first ones to deploy with them. And they still had some issues, but they were different enough that all of us came from MH-47Es. So we could fly Es and Gs, but guys that were Es that hadn't had the G qualification course couldn't fly Gs. So there was a weird, for a while, the regiment's 47 force was kind of split into 47 Echo pilots and 47 G pilots. And that was a problem for this particular mission. So we're sitting in Fort Lewis, and I can't remember, I want to say it was like June or so of 2007. And they're like, hey, everybody, I think I wasn't scheduled to deploy until like August or September. They're like, hey, everybody needs to pack up. There's a C-17 coming tomorrow. Everybody needs to head to Bagram. I'm like, what the hell? Like, and all the remaining Chinooks that we had on station are all getting broken down like within 24 hours. Everything's heading over there. And I'm like, what the hell? So finally, one of our platooners, I'm like, dude, what is going on? Because we're pissed. I'm like, it's summer in Washington. I haven't seen the sun yet. I want to like hang out. And anyway, so he's like, hey, they've, someone is, and that's all he said. He's like, someone spotted a man in a white robe. And that's all they said. And so we head over to Bagram, and,
Thinking
it
it
comes
might
out,
be UBL. It might be
yeah,
bin Laden,
yeah,
right? Is the
well, it turns
implication.
out it actually was. Um, and this is some successes that came out of a failure, which is why nobody really talks about it. So we head over there, and no kidding, every flyable Chinook in the regiment is sitting on the ramp of Bagram, 14 of them at that time. So they had pulled them from everywhere we had Chinooks, Iraq, all that kind of stuff. They were all sitting on the ramp of Bagram, which is actually a pretty impressive sight. And so all the power players in the regiment, dudes that are absolute legends. I'm not even qualified to carry their helmet bag. Like the gang's all there, the regiment, RCO. I mean, everybody's there, and it's a big deal. And this is like a 2-week planning cycle. And and the guy who led it, his call sign was Cosmo. Half of it's because he's smart, and half of it because he was absolutely goofy. But he was easily, without giving his name, the most humble, smartest guy that I have ever flown with. And nobody ever knows his name because he's a humble guy. He's like hiding somewhere in the country, flying medevac quietly, with his wife and kids. And but I have never ever met a guy that had the clarity of thought that he did. But he was the mastermind, and he planned this entire assault out, which I guarantee was every bit as complex, as the actual operation that captured Bin Laden in 2011. Probably more so because it had more assets involved. But Cosmo, got us all together, and we had dudes from all over the regiment there. And Al Mack actually didn't make that one; he was somewhere else, but he wasn't there for that. And it was a big assault. So when we all get there, the funny part is I'm like stressed out. I'm like, dude, I'm a brand new FMQ. Like I haven't done I need to do a rotation as an FMQ first before I can be a part of this. Like it's pretty stressful. And throughout this whole 2 week thing, um, like their metrics, we have to do the whole thing. We have to write letters home and all that, and it is pretty emotional. Um, because everything we hear from like the JAG and ISR and the Intel stuff like that, they're like, yeah, they're like, this is going to go okay for everyone except the helicopters. Because the area we're flying, which you can imagine, it's 11,000 foot peaks on both sides. We're having to go one way in, one way out, at 60 knots because of the terrain, and they're all saying like, when they go through and they're doing the percentages and stuff like, yeah, AC-130s will be good, the B2s will be fine, blah, blah, blah. Like helicopters, we're anticipating 30 to 40%, and so that's pretty emotional, but not to be dramatic, but I liken it to, the B-17 crews in Europe in World War II. I mean, you just you just go do it. You know, you just got to stay in line and drop your bombs and do what you do, even though it sucks.
Mike, had you ever felt like that before? Had you had this kind of pronounced, like, this might be it?
Never, never, never. Which is why it's kind of emotional, you know. And I'm sure other guys have felt it in different teams and stuff like that. This just happened to be the first occasion, And we've done assaults before. I've done assaults before and never really had that, but it was such a predetermined and deliberate thing where like, hey, this is, and they go through the whole thing, probably very much like they did, for the actual op in 2011. They're like, hey, this is very historic. Don't underestimate what this means, and kind of like if it goes sideways, just know it's worth it. But that doesn't make it any easier with all the preparation stuff. To include, our battalion flight surgeon was there, and he's like, hey, if you guys need some extra Ambien for tonight, I'll understand, considering it's probably going to be a hard night to
Wow.
sleep. Um, so, I mean, it was pretty.
How did Mike, just real quick, how did it feel to be a part of that? Like, I have to imagine it felt pretty amazing to be just in that group.
It was, and right behind me, I've got some pictures I haven't framed yet, but everybody took. There was like 4 different companies involved, flight companies. So everybody had their, the usual you do. It's pretty historic. Everybody had pictures taken with a helicopter and their company flags, and then the whole task force, had their pictures with the customers and all that. And so it was a big deal. And I don't think I realized at the time how big a deal it was, until you see what the impact it had in 2011. But my role in it, it made me nervous, but I was soothed by the fact that I was told as soon as I got on the ground, hey, your only job is to run the spare aircraft. You're such a new FMQ. You're only going to run the spare. So my my stuff in the planning area was, I'm like, I honestly, I won't say I wasn't listening. Of course, I was listening, but I wasn't taking it on probably as to heart as seriously as the guys who are numerically designated as assault as in the assault. Right? I'm like, well, I'm just going to keep the spare going. So my job was to keep the spare set of the 14. I was number 14, to, and they gave me a co-pilot who ended up being an awesome dude, but he was having some problems, and so he was like the least desirable co-pilot that they didn't really want in the assault. So it was me and him, and he was a totally cool guy. And so we kind of laughed. We're like, dude, I'm glad I'm the spare on this one. After the big mission brief, I'm like, I'm glad I'm in the spare. He's like, yeah, me too. We high fived. And so on mission day, our job as briefed was, because the flight was half MH-47s, and there was like 12 or 13 helicopters. It was the largest helicopter assault since Panama for Army aviation.
Wow.
And, they were going to fly all 13 in on this assault. And there was, without getting too much details, the op started 2 days ahead of time. The go signal was 48 hours ahead of time. B2s came in, dropped their stuff, and then, whatever it was, 6 minutes ahead of the assault, the B1s came in, and then 2 minutes ahead, the AC-130s let loose. I mean, it was a huge tiered effort. And then we roll in at 60 knots in the smoke and flames, to save the day. That was the gist of it. But we're like, dude, that sounds like it's going to suck. So I'm really glad that we're just running the spare. And so half the flight was MH-47Es, led by an extremely competent, legendary 2nd Battalion Flight Lead, and then MH-47Gs, right? And remember, you can't swap. Pilots can't swap. So part of the bump plan was, hey, if one of the MH-47Es goes down, he's out. We can't replace it with a G, but they had this plan where the crews couldn't swap. So if you were flying an E, you couldn't just bump one of the G crews out. Your helicopter was just out. Again, I'm like, I don't really care because I'm number 14. So me and this guy, and he ended up retiring as a W5. That tells you what kind of guy he was.
Wow.
He wasn't a bottom feeder. It was just, he was pretty new, and they're like, yeah, he does not cut out for this. We only want the top dudes. And the only reason I was back there because I was I couldn't be as a BMQ, and I was a brand new FMQ. So, I had to run all the flight plans. Anyway, so our only job was whoever fell out of the Gs, like if one of their aircraft failed on startup or whatever, we were going to have the spare all running and hot with the correct flight plan. So we had, you know, 7 or 8 different flight plans all ready to go. So mission night, we actually leave Bagram, go to another location, to pre-stage in a flight of 14 Chinooks. So, my guess is if the enemy didn't already know we were coming, a flight of 14 Chinooks at midnight probably gave up, probably gave it up. Um, so, so we land and everybody's getting fueled. This is absolutely the shining moment to date for the regiment because everybody from the fuelers to the ground dudes, the crew chiefs, everybody is clicking. And remember, I said the flight is led by an MH-47E from 2nd Battalion, and so we're sitting back there and we're all running, right? Or we're all shut down, getting gas, waiting for the final from the customer, the go, the Irene call, and so they're like, all right, we got it. Everybody's cranking, and in 2 minutes, and the countdown, and you hear whatever the call sign was for that. You hear blah blah. I've got a chip light. I'm out.
So it's like an error message, right?
Lead.
It's an
That was
error
the
message.
lead. Yeah. So that was actually it was the element lead for the MH-47Es. And so the Air Mission Commander, who was the regimental commander at the time, whatever, I don't even remember what our call sign was. We'll say 14, but he's like, 14, lead is out. Air Mission Commander is coming back to your ship. You're now one. Like, and I literally like look at the dude I'm next to. Are you shitting me? And utter panic. And I say one, like we didn't lead it. It was an element lead somewhere in that 14, but we had the Air Mission Commander with us because that MH-47E was out. So we went from really not paying attention because we were just running the spare to now we were actually leading a flight of 4 into this fiery canyon, in the into the mountains, and we still had to, we had the customers, the full customer load in the back. Every helicopter is full of customers. So we had 3 minutes. He's like, he'll be back. AMC will be back there in 3 minutes. So, I'm looking at him and I'm like, all right, get this thing started. I'm getting the flight plan in and all this, and I get the correct flight plan in. And, long story short, not to say it was flawless, but we took off on time. We went through a hellish canyon because, again, it wasn't the enemy that was the problem. It was the B1s, the B2s, the AC-130s, just pounding this, pre-assault fires before we get in this canyon. Everything from wires, there's residential wires struck across the canyons, and we're doing 60 knots, and then we had to climb up to 11,000 feet from sea level to 11,000 feet to infill these guys, and then come back down, and we're all doing it with mid gas. And there's literally, as you can imagine, there are Chinooks everywhere because we were only about 15 minutes from the base we launched from, and you can see in your nods, there's because everybody, all 13 helicopters had their own individual flight plan, and their customers were all going to different infill points. So just out of your goggles, you're just seeing, again, with all the fires and stuff and everything burning, and you see Chinooks are under you and over you. Everybody's doing exactly what they're supposed to. But to say that my stress level was, through the roof. But one of the things I can be pretty animated and intense on the ground. But one of the things that God gave me is when I'm in the aircraft, everything. I'm actually my calmest in the aircraft. The guy I was flying with did awesome. We went from being the spares to being like the heroes that saved the day. Not that we did anything heroic, but like I said, we went from the spare to taking over for a flight lead and actually leading the element into the assault area. But everybody did awesome job. I mean, it was when we got back, it was a mission failure, obviously, because we didn't get the objective that we were looking for various reasons. But what we pulled off, considering my dumbass in the back seat with the least desirable co-pilot, and we
Come on.
still, and not to be cliche, but the training kind of took over and everybody performed exactly as they're supposed to. But that op, believe it or not, is how we started out this horribly intense 90-day rotation. That was the very first assault we did. And once we got back from
Wow.
that, we're like, okay, sucks. We didn't get him back to normal. And then we just started doing assaults every single night for the next, 86 days or so.
Jeez.
So, so that was, I say for something that didn't result in, you know, whatever enemy action or something like that. Like it was a pretty intense way to start a deployment, and you grow up really, really fast.
What was in 2000? Is it? I think it's 2011 when we actually get Bin Laden. The crew that they select for that, Mike. I would assume you know them. I'm not asking you to name them. They just. I have to imagine similar caliber, like they're bringing in the heavy hitters for that.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you got to know they brought in the A team for that, um, and not that anybody else in the regiment couldn't do it, but when you only have whatever 4 6 cockpits
Yeah.
to fill, and you've got the entire regiment to choose from, you're not going to risk it by the dummy who just got out of green platoon. I'm like, yeah, he's got the same initials after his name as the other guy, but the other guy's been doing it for 15 years or whatever. So, you talk about an absolute no fail, has to go right um, mission. So yeah, they definitely picked the A team, which is why it was successful.
And you said they learned a lot from what you guys did in '07, right? For that,
Oh
that
yeah,
kind of helped. It wasn't
more so in the
14
realm
aircraft.
of, well, both aircraft and more so in the realm of foretelling and security and stuff like that. I mean, and that was really, anybody who talks about that, that was really the failing of the first attempt was, obviously the target gets spooked and steps back across the border. And I mean, like I said, there was a lot of lessons learned, and every once in a while, that's why I say you never hear about it, but when you read, O'Neill's book, he refers to a little bit the assault in '07, and in that goofy movie Zero Dark 30, you hear Chris Pratt say, well, we tried that back in '07 for Bin Laden, and we lost a couple guys, which is untrue. That actually didn't happen, but you do hear it referred to every once in a while. Um, but a lot of lessons learned. Like I said, just the exercise of having to write that letter, and looking at everybody, and I'm like, all right, man, let's kind of like saying, let's go take this ass whooping, let's get it over with.
And you probably
But
had at least two kids at the time, Mike. No?
I think we only had one
You
at that
still have
point.
one. That's no
Nope,
joke,
no,
though.
no, no, I take that back. We had two because I had another
Yeah.
one who was born in Green Platoon when I was in basic skills. So yeah, all the boys were. So we had a wife sitting at, I had a wife sitting in Fort Lewis at the time, with the two youngest at home. And of course, she didn't know. She just knew that I left, but you know, she was a smart girl. She spent 12 years in the Navy, and she's not a dummy. As I say, she's kind of like hard as woodpecker lips. She knows the deal. But as many details as she'd want. Of course, there's not any there, and you can't ever say, "Hey, this might be," you
Might
know.
be it.
Yeah, and if you've heard in aviation before, there's when you walk out the airplane, what do they say? There's um, the two worst days of your life is walking out to the aircraft knowing it's your last day, and walking out to the aircraft not knowing it's your last day.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the deal. I mean, we did everything, something could go wrong. Every one of the assaults that we ever did in the 16 or 17 deployments that I did could happen all the time. And I got stories for days on that. But going out on the one time where something's going to go wrong, or you have a higher than likely chance that something's going to go sideways. That's a whole different deal. So I don't know why it's different, but it is.
For sure. Let me ask you this, and I'm going to get you out of here soon because I know I've taken you way longer than I told you. Um,
I didn't even notice,
when you
except the
look
things like
back,
I said.
no, it's been great, man. When you look back at your time, Mike, I'm curious what one of the most courageous things you saw, and it can be in the teams, it can be in the regiment. But as you kind of look back, I mean, 17 deployments is a lot of time downrange. What's one of the most courageous things you remember?
Um, I was witness to, I mean, guys in the regiment, we did what we did because we would never ever leave a customer behind. So I never got to make any of those decisions. I was just, a pilot for a flight lead that was making those heroic decisions. But the customers that we supported, Ranger Regiment guys, SEAL Team Six, which predominantly a lot of the CAG guys, Delta guys. Um, and it sounds cheesy, but night after night, I always consider them like we fly helicopters, and relatively speaking, I'm like, well, this is pretty easy because I know how much it sucks on the ground, and so I was always absolutely in awe. Which sounds funny. I was in awe of the customers, even though I was one at one time. Because what I would see them do every single night, the American public has absolutely no idea. Just for example, what they endured over a 6 hour period just to get to a target, only to be dealt with, no kidding, overwhelming fire, guys getting shot left and right, taking casualties, and still maintaining composure, completing the objective, and bringing everybody home. And I know that sounds really, really vague, but there's just so many examples that I got to be witness to. I mean, it's humbling, and I'm like, of course, you always have to ask, I'm like, dude, when I was in SEAL teams, I'm not sure, what I mean? Like, I'm not sure I'd have had the metal to do what these guys are doing. Who knows? But that's something you always ask yourself. I'm like, I saw some guys getting some nasty battles, and the sad part is, once the assault's complete, and we're in the middle of crappy Afghanistan or Iraq or whatever, and guys get killed on these assaults, and it happens more often than the American public was aware of. Um, but you're in this crappy makeshift fob in the middle of nowhere, and that's what these guys have to bring their friends back to, at the end of the night. And some of the most gut wrenching things that I had to fly were not, they were not assaults, they were exfils where we had to bring these guys out, whether that's under fire or whatever. But some of the most gut wrenching, difficult things we had to do is flying helicopters with, guys dying in the back, which I know is not uncommon to medevac crews and stuff like that, but it takes on a different flavor, I guess, when you're still in the middle of the assault, and the heart's pumping and everything's going on. So all that did, like I said, it's um, I got to see uh, so much bravery and heroism. It's pretty humbling. And there is lots. The one thing I'll say that's probably controversial is there's all kinds of guys in the news, SEALs, Delta guys, Rangers, whatever. But unfortunately, mostly SEALs. That everybody looks up to and idolize, and on instant or social media. Um, but I will tell you, there are, with the exception of the guys who have the Medal of Honor, and it's kind of hard for them to hide, but they're also very humble, quiet individuals. You don't really see them anywhere else. Um, there are some dudes out there who are living out quiet lives now as bankers, auto car salesmen, stuff like that. But you talk about some guys that have changed the course of American history, and nobody will ever, ever know their name, ever. And it's not because they're hiding or anything; they're just humble, quiet guys. So that's what I usually, when you see dudes blowing up Instagram, or their favorite energy drink, or they run 10 marathons a month or whatever, those are not the dudes. Honestly, those are not generally the guys that were doing the deed, and changing the course of history and saving lives. It's the ones that nobody ever hears about. So that's kind of my foot in the sand. And if I ever have a jackass side, which I'm told I do pretty frequently, it's, like, oh, dude, do you know this guy? I saw him on Instagram. I'm like, yeah, he's a shitbird. He was a turd in the teams, and he's a turd now. Um, so take that for what it's worth. That's my
I
only
gotcha.
ending point.
Then one of the things that really struck me, I just wanted to touch on when prepping for this, Mike, was when you said when you got out, you wanted nothing to do with the teams, with the regiment. You just wanted to get away. Could you just speak to that? Because I think other people have felt that. I think a lot of vets have gone that route. How was it for you?
Well, so obviously I got kids in the Army now, so totally different. And I'm trying to prep them so maybe they don't spend 30 years and waste their entire life. I'm like, 20 is plenty, 10 is probably good. But, um, as we all do, I spent, whatever. I should have retired at 20. I went to 30. So I'm pretty sure from like year 19 to year 30, all I did was bitch about being in the Army and plan on getting out, which I'm sure is not uncommon, for whatever service you're in. That's just what we do. We complain, you know. Um, but I spent all this time complaining and making plans, and I mean, just not outside the realm of normal complaining, just what we all do, because that's how you make it through deployments, and that's how you're always trying to get to a different place. And I can't wait to get out, and I can't wait to retire, and so I had this whole big thing on how awesome retirement was going to be and how it was going to play out, and so I had this big plan, and then retirement hit, and it came really abrupt because all the way up till we'll say 6 months prior to retiring, um, I was like, oh, I can't wait. I got all this going on. We're gonna have a great time. And then, when you realize like this machine is now irreversible, I've made this because I could have gone on, I turned down W-5. I could have gone on to do other stuff, go be a brigade senior warrant officer or whatever it was going to be. I mean, it was going to be something coming out of West Point. It was going to be something, large and staff like. And so I remember a couple months prior to retirement, I'm like, this is not reversible anymore. Like I can't say, we'd already bought a house in Indiana. We were going to retire all stuff. I'm like, all right, this can't change now. Like we're committed to it. And so I was still like, oh, it's going to be great. I can't wait to have all this time to myself. And, all the things that we put in our heads are going to be awesome about retiring or getting out. And then retirement day happened. And I distinctly, I'm in my ASUs, all the bling, all the cool medals, all that kind of stuff. And I walked back up to my office at West Point, and I actually kind of broke down in tears for a while because it hit me at that very second. Like this will be the last time that I ever wear a uniform. And it was pretty impactful. Um, and I remember specifically, and I probably took a half an hour unbuttoning, just I'm like, there's something to savor here. I don't know exactly what it is, but I'm trying. And of course, I don't remember what it was now, but so that was hard. And then we moved on to civilian life, and I don't know what it was, maybe because I complained so much and convinced myself that it's such a good thing to be out of the Army. The Army sucks. I'm so glad I'm not in anymore, and all the things. But for whatever reason, I had absolutely, I want to say for like 2 years or so, absolutely, I had no desire. Was not a joiner. Um, didn't talk to any of my fellow team guys. Didn't talk to any guys out of the 160th or what. Like just kind of pulled back. And I was probably obviously dealing with my own self-destructive demons at the time as well. But I just didn't have a desire to be part of that. And then at some point when I started getting my wits about myself and sort of getting back to what we in our family we would consider normal, I'm like, okay. And then one by one, like I would talk to a guy and reach out, like, oh, feels so good, feels so good to talk to that guy. And my wife and I both had a realization because you got to remember we're in the middle of Amish Indiana. There's no military, and I consider myself high speed, and so is my wife, and so are my sons. I mean, we all grew up that way, and we're in the middle of this slow Amish community. And I had a really good friend of mine I've been friends with for 25 years, who was a retired PJ. He was actually at the 22nd STS. He was a Tier 1 PJ, and turned out he was from the same town we lived in. Anyway, so he came back and visited, and just having him in our kitchen, you know, and talking the way team guys talk after not having any contact for 2 years, and my wife laughed. She's like, "It's so easy." She's like, "I remember what it's like now. It's so easy to have our people, to talk to our kind of people." And it's true. Um, I even notice on the rare occasion she's in the company of another team guy's wife or another 160th pilot's wife. I mean, it's a vastly different conversation and a much easier conversation. I mean, even the girls, they fall into something different, just like we do, when I see somebody from my past. So anyway, it was a hard 2 years, and for whatever reason, I just didn't want anything to do with it. Um, and then, once I say he got better, but kind of started getting healthy on several different fronts. It was a much more enjoyable, and it's fun now because now we're all in our 50s. Our kids are all old. We're all going through the same things. We're
That's
all
right.
old and fat and gray. And it's pretty funny now because we laugh at a lot of things that we did when we were, young 20 something or 30 something pilots. And so it's much more fun now. And it's much more healthy. And maybe that's just, phases of life. And maybe that's just the way it's supposed to be.
You're still flying though, and I think that's the one thing I want to make sure we touch on here. Like, you're not done in the cockpit by any means.
Probably like flew 11 hours yesterday, 7 hours the day before. So I am definitely not retired. And that was part of, plus I love flying. So I'll do that as long as I'm physically able. But I fly more now probably than I ever did, because we own businesses that fly. So, you know, they're not quite the million dollar ventures that we hope them to be someday. So now we have to do it with sweat equity. But yeah, we own, I think, a total of 7 or 8 airplanes now. I haven't stopped to check as of late, but so yeah, fly all the time. And I think part of that is it's my therapy. It is my mission. And as I read more about, guys that get out and retire and stuff, and that's their whole problem is they don't know what they're going to do. And I didn't realize this, but there's entire charities devoted to helping vets figure out what they're going to do with their life. I never had that problem. I mean, I always knew what I was going to do, much like the whole duration of the 30 years. But it was just hard to break away from the institution. And, amazingly come to find out the civilian world, and particularly aviation, does not operate like the 160th. So I brought a lot of that with me, and it was not. I won't say it was very popular. So I've had to change my mechanisms of entry
That's right.
when it comes to flying in the civilian world. So,
Yeah.
but it's getting much better now, and like I said, it's my purpose, so it's helpful. Um, and that's not forever either. I don't. It won't be my purpose forever.
Yeah. This is Rutledge Airborne, right? Have you flown with the kids? Do your kids fly?
Uh, you know, one of them does. Well, yeah. So our oldest, which I kind of told you, we sort of adopted.
Yeah.
Um, I think it's starting at age 13, and we kind of helped him, followed him through college and his career, and when he was in flight school, so I pinned his wings on him. Commissioned him when he graduated college, and pinned his wings on at Fort Rucker when he graduated, or Fort Novacell now, I guess it's called.
Wow.
Um, Pinned his wings on at Rucker, and I remember distinctly because he wanted to go to the 160th, and I'm like, dude, I could pull strings for you, and of course I can make that happen. I said, but the only thing you can't do is you can't pick Apaches. You know, now
Damn.
I know, and I know this is going long, but like everyone else, anyone who tells you that they don't want to fly Apaches is a liar. I want to fly Apaches. I just don't want to be an Apache pilot. There's a difference.
Oh, dude, you're killing me, Mike. You're
Yeah,
killing me,
but anybody
man.
who says they don't want to fly Apaches is lying. That's like everybody saying, "No, I never want to fly fighter jets. It's not for me." It's a lie. We just won't admit it. Anyway, so I told the kid, I said, "Hey, if you want to go to the regiment, do not fly Apaches. Only because it's just hard. Apaches don't necessarily equate to anything. It's easier if you fly Hawks or Chinooks or something like that. It's an easier transition. There's more slots for them. Anyway, so what's he do? Picks Apaches. So
That's what I'm talking about.
yeah, he did. So he did the whole, you know, gun gun bunny thing for a couple tours. Ended up doing was a company commander. And anyway, so now a few months ago, I pulled a couple strings, and he's actually in my old company, A Company Fort Battalion that I started. And when he actually checked in, they gave him my old desk, and so he's a platoon leader now in my old company flying MH-47s.
How special is that?
It's pretty
Did he
neat.
pick 47s, Mike, because of you?
Uh, well, I don't know, but I did tell him, I did give him the intel on when he goes to assess. I'm like, listen, kid, and they knew. What was funny is so his last name is not Rutledge, and so but a few guys knew, and I said, Nick, you're going to do really well. I said, but you can't let this out of the bag, man. You can't let them know, that we're together. I said, because it's going to be rough on you. And he did. Like, he held a straight face, and so finally a couple of them figured it out. Like, dude, you're the one. You're Otter's kid. And so I told him, I said, when you go there and they ask you what you want to fly, you tell them I will fly anything to the needs of the regiment. I said, that's what you say. So I don't know. But he said, he goes, yeah, but he goes, I picked MH-47. That was my first choice. So, but getting him to 4th Battalion, I'll shamedly admit that was my doing.
That's awesome.
But yeah, and he loves it, and they just had a newborn a couple weeks ago. So, I mean, there's the circle. What's fun,
Yeah.
the only cool thing about getting old is watching the circle, you know, repeat itself. That is utterly enjoyable, being able to look back as a parent and see that. So that is the good part about getting old. So I don't regret that at all.
And did I just hear you drop your call sign? Was it Otter?
Yes, yes. Which was actually given to me by Al Mack in Green Platoon.
For
And
something
it's not
good?
flattering. It's not as cool. It's not like blade or laser. I'm like, there's nothing cool about it, which I don't understand because every Air Force guy I run across has got some cool, flash, rock. But mine's Otter, and it was not meant to be a compliment. So when I was in Green Platoon, and I was kind of a punk, and Al Mack was one of my instructor pilots, and they had just gotten back from the war, and they were all fired up, and he's like, "You're going to be called Otter because that's the most degrading variation of SEAL that I can think of," and it just stuck. I mean, there was, for better or worse, you know, the Army, as you well know, the Army's not huge on call signs or nicknames. It's just not a
Yeah,
thing. So what started out being kind of a degrading smack in the face turned out to sort of be my signature. And what's funny is within Army aviation, there are more people who don't know my name, but they know who the Otter is, but couldn't tell you what my first or last name is.
that's great.
Yeah.
That is
So
great.
like I said, I won't say it's not really a call sign, but it was definitely a signature for my 14 years in the regiment.
Got it. All right. Last two questions. I ask everybody these, Mike. One is, was there anything you carried with you when you were downrange for you when you were flying that had sentimental value, something that somebody gave you that you just wanted to have with you?
Absolutely. Everybody does carry that. And I remember going on that mission for Bin Laden. I look over at Ed and I'm like, Ed, what do you carry? And he pulled out one of his daughter's handkerchiefs that smelled like his daughter. So what I always carried, so both my youngest boys were young, and I can't remember, maybe 4 and 3 or 5 and 2 or something like that. And Joshua, who's now an infantryman at Fourth ID at Fort Carson, he loved trucks, and so I don't remember if my wife said, "Hey, do you want to give Dad something?" or he did it on his own, but he gave me his favorite Matchbox truck. And then Matthew, who's now 19 and a freshman in college, he loved Little Men, which I think's just odd, but he always had little like figurines and whatever Little Men. So he had this spaceman. He'd walk around the house and my spaceman. So I had this truck and this spaceman, and my wife rubber banded them together for me. And so for 16 deployments, every time I flew, even though my kids were older, the truck and the spaceman were in the pocket of my flight suit for every single flight for 16 deployments.
Which pocket? Where'd you keep them?
Always in the right bottom leg pocket for whatever reason. I don't remember why, but that's just always where they were.
That's
And they
cool.
had their
That's
own
really
pockets.
cool.
So med kit, blowout kits, all that kind of stuff, survival stuff. They all had their own spots, but the bottom right leg pocket was always, and I think it's because I'm right-handed, and I could always reach down and feel if they were still there to make sure I didn't lose them. So that's what I always did. I mean, I would always, before we went and flew, and when we got back, it was a bouncy ride or whatever, and I'd always reach down just so I can still feel the truck and spaceman in my bottom pocket. They're still there. And then, every night we get done, I'd take them out of my flight suit, put them on, whatever nightstand I had. Next day, put on a clean flight suit, spaceman, and then truck go back in the pocket.
That's awesome. That's a great one, man. Last question I ask everybody: you spent a lot of time in the military, a lot of time away from home, a lot of sacrifice, and you watch those guys go out the ramp many times. As you look back on that time, Mike, would you go back and do it again?
It kind of depends on what point you would catch me on. I will always say yes, um, yes, because I don't regret any part of it at all. Um, One of the probably a very emotional point to end the interview on, but when Josh, my son who's now in the infantry, when he decided to join the Army. And you got to remember, I was gone almost all of his life, um, and he did very well with it. But I'm like, I missed all that stuff, and I didn't realize it until he was a couple weeks from leaving for boot camp. And that's a hard hitting, like you can't change that. And I actually, one of the few times I've written stuff down, and I actually had to write it down to some of my soft brothers, as a matter of fact, because I'm like, hey, there's whether there's actually a website that has like a back room that only vetted operators can get into, and I wrote them like, dudes, what do I do about this? I said, because I'm feeling like I'm going to explode, and I basically said, uh, well, a couple weeks before he left, I was like, hey, Josh, let's do this. And, basically trying to make up for 18 years, in 2 weeks. And he sweetly looked at me, and he wasn't being snarky or anything, and he's like, why are we doing this now? And it wasn't a slap in the face. He was just like, let's be real. We're not gonna fix all this in 2 weeks. And it's getting kind of artificial. Like, let's run and get ice cream. Let's play trucks. Which by the way, my wife still reminds me is when he was little and he always had trucks and he would say, hey, Daddy, can you play trucks with me? And, 9 times out of 10, I was like, hey, Daddy, I'll play with you later. I'm kind of busy right now, or, whatever. And so my biggest regret, I was telling my wife, you know what? I should have stopped whatever I was doing and I should have played trucks with him, because when he's 18, about to head out the door, I would do anything to sit and play trucks with him for a half hour. But he's like, why are we bothering doing this now? And, the morning that he left for basic to go to boot camp, like I often did, because I'd come home at 2 in the morning, smelling like Jet A or gunpowder or whatever, and I would always come in and kiss him 2, 3 in the morning, whatever it was I got home. And so, again, it's like 3 or 4 in the morning, and he's this 18-year-old, 180-pound mammoth, furry mammoth in this bed, and I'm just like sitting there petting his hair like I used to when he was little. And, at that point, I'm like, this is some bullshit. What have I done? So that's when I say you depends on when you ask me, um, because I distinctly remember me having a meeting with the regimental warrant officer of the 160th at some point when I was doing these back-to-back 90 on, 90 off, nonstop, after like the 10th or 12th one. And I'm like, hey, my family's taking a beating, I need a break. And he literally said, he's like, you know, kids they're like rubber balls. They're really resilient, just it was always like, just give us another couple of years, give us another year here, give us another 6 months. And so I told these friends of mine, other operators, I'm like, dude, I would give up every single piece of shiny bling, all the stories, Mike, I would give all that up just to play trucks again, or heaven forbid, all the dates I missed for my wife or missing my wife, or all the, my littlest son, all the things that I should have taught him, like I should have taught him how to change oil. I should have been around, teach him how to, change tires, or heaven forbid, we got all these airplanes and none of my kids know how to fly. You know what I mean? Like all those things. So, the career is awesome and it briefs really well. And the shadow box is great, but the stories that the shadow box don't tell is the impact, and the chunk of flesh that it took out of the family to do that. Fortunately, we survived, but to say there's not wounds there that'll always be there. And, my boys will probably carry some of that when they have boys. And they might say, you know, I'm never going to do like my dad did. I'm never going to be gone 9 months out of the year all the time. So there's definitely nothing's free. So you just can't get that time back.
Yeah, first of all, thank you for sharing that, and well said.
I'm sure I'm not the only one. Just maybe I
No,
articulate better.
uh, honest to God, man. I mean, your kids still talk to you, and that's not the case with everyone who was gone for a lot of 2001 until today. One of the guys I interviewed, Derek Natalini, who's a former Delta operator. He was saying like, yeah, I'd go back and do it again, but at 5 o'clock when I'm home, I'd go home and I'd eat dinner with the family and just spend time with them instead of going to the range one more time. And it always circles around the family, those
You
comments.
just you just never think. You always think, oh, I've got more time. I've got another day. I've got whatever. And pretty soon, time just runs out. That's what you find out at the end.
Oh, God. It's a good, I guess I'm taking this real personally because I got 3 boys in this house and I'm doing this. So
Yeah,
I
you
still
can't
got a
ever
few
get that
more
time back.
years.
Cherish every
Yeah.
minute of it. You can't ever get it back.
Mike, thanks so much for the time, man. I took you a lot longer than I had promised, but I really appreciate it. It's been a long time. I know a lot of guys from your world, and it's been really special to have you on. Thank you so much.
It was my pleasure, Ryan. It seemed like 30 minutes, but thanks for drawing all those stories out of it. My kids will probably get to hear some stuff they never got to hear before, so thanks for sucking that out.
I hope you enjoyed this combat story. Since we were talking to someone who is a former SEAL and 160th pilot, I thought we'd get a comment from previous interviews with SEALs and 160th pilots. So, first one is from the Mack interview, and the comment is at BigShot9557. Thank you for being a subscriber, first of all. And he said, love this interview. I'm going to buy the book. I don't read much, but to hear it from the man that flew the Chinook and telling the story from the outside, looking down, the book has to be good. Heard the story from the SEALs, so to hear it from this side is very interesting. I loved it. Thank you for saying that. This is something that I hope people take away, which is we just scratch the surface on a lot of these things, but these books go into detail, not just about these combat moments, but a lot of the day-to-day things that you don't hear much about. And I distinctly remember this from reading Black Hawk Down and the insight into these 160th operators, the Delta operators, the Rangers, you really never heard before. So thank you. I know, and it's important to Al that people are reading the book. It's sharing stories about a lot of the other warriors he worked with, like Mike Rutledge. These next comments are on our interview with Jonathan Kleck, a former SEAL. First one's from at Scott Bartlett 4853, a subscriber. Thank you very much for subscribing to this. Said, I looked at this and said to myself, 2 hours, really? Okay, I'll listen to the first bit. 2 hours later, here I am letting you know that I did it. This was a great interview. Thank you from a former staff sergeant that drank Budweiser. I'm sure, but now is more into Pinot Grigio. LOL. And for those who listened, we had Jonathan, who's now, not only does he run a company, but he's also a stand-up comedian. And I asked him to give us what different branches of the military might drink for alcoholic beverages. And he did not disappoint. So that was a reference to that. The next comment here on the same interview was from another subscriber at Outlaw19Able. I just wanted to say thank you for subscribing. Then also he says, I was on that helicopter when this happened. And this is a reference to what Jonathan's talking about during a training accident that's pretty scary. It's in the first few seconds of the interview if you want to hear it. And he says, I was on the helicopter when this happened. It was in Puerto Rico, and the crew chief saved the lives of the rest of the stick by blocking them from going out. I remember it well. And then what's really cool here is Jonathan Kleck himself responds, and he says, thanks for the input. I'm embarrassed that I totally forgot to mention that bit in the interview. He did save lives that night. And of course, there were 2 people who were pulled out of the aircraft. Thank you for sharing that. It's really, I think, so incredible to see the full circle, people who are involved in these stories, who are listening in. It's got to be surreal hearing these. It's happened to me a few times listening to other podcasts. So thank you for listening. Thank you for subscribing. If you don't already subscribe, I'd love for you to do that. If you could take the time to leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, that also helps get the stories of these warriors out to more people. So with that, thanks for sticking it out to the end here with us. Thank you for being listeners, and stay safe, y'all. Till the next time.